Long before the marble columns and golden altars that would one day define the heart of Catholic Christianity, the Vatican Hill stood as a wild and mysterious place on the western bank of the Tiber River. The ancient Romans called it Mons Vaticanus, a name whose origins stretch back into the mists of prehistory, possibly derived from the Latin word vates, meaning prophet or soothsayer. This etymology hints at the sacred nature this ground held even for the pagan peoples who first settled the 7 hills of Rome. The Etruscans, that enigmatic civilization that preceded Roman dominance in central Italy, considered this hill a place where the veil between the mortal world and the realm of the gods grew thin. Their priests would climb its slopes to observe the flight patterns of birds, reading in their movements the will of the deities who governed fate and fortune. These auguries, performed in the open air beneath the vast Mediterranean sky, established a tradition of divine consultation that would echo through millennia, though the gods invoked would change beyond all recognition. In those earliest days, the Vatican Hill remained largely uninhabited, considered unsuitable for settlement due to its distance from the Roman Forum and its reputation for unhealthy air. The clay soil, prone to retaining moisture, bred mosquitoes in the warm months, and malaria stalked those who ventured too near the marshy areas at its base. Romans of the Republic preferred to keep their distance, using the area primarily for pottery production, taking advantage of the same clay that made the land treacherous for permanent dwelling. The transformation of this marginal land began under the early emperors, who saw in its very remoteness an opportunity for pleasure gardens and recreational spaces away from the crowded streets of Rome proper. Agrippina the Elder, mother of the Emperor Caligula, established elaborate gardens on the northern slope of the hill, creating a paradise of exotic plants, flowing fountains, and shaded walkways where the imperial family could escape the pressures of governance and the watching eyes of the Senate. Her son Caligula would expand these gardens further, but his most lasting contribution to the site was the construction of a private circus, a racing track for chariots that would become infamous in the annals of Christian history. This circus, later enlarged and embellished by his nephew Nero, stretched along the base of the hill, its wooden seats and barriers creating an arena where the emperor could indulge his passion for racing without the crowds of the Circus Maximus. Nero inherited not just the circus, but also his family's love for the Vatican gardens, expanding them with characteristic excess. He imported rare trees from the furthest reaches of the empire, constructed artificial lakes stocked with exotic fish, and built pavilions where he could compose his poetry and practice his singing, much to the dismay of those forced to attend his performances. The gardens became a reflection of Nero's artistic pretensions and his desire to transform Rome into a new Troy, with himself as its divinely inspired ruler. It was in this setting of imperial luxury and excess that one of history's most consequential events would unfold. In the year 64 AD, a great fire swept through Rome, destroying huge swathes of the ancient city. While Nero may or may not have fiddled as Rome burned, he certainly took advantage of the destruction to build his massive Domus Aurea, the Golden House, on the cleared land. But the Roman people, devastated by the loss of their homes and livelihoods, needed someone to blame for the catastrophe. Nero found his scapegoats in a small but growing religious sect that worshipped a crucified Jewish preacher named Jesus of Nazareth. The Christians, as they called themselves, already stood apart from Roman society with their refusal to participate in the state religion and their strange rituals that included symbolic cannibalism, as their critics characterized the Eucharist. They made perfect targets for an emperor desperate to deflect blame from himself. The persecution that followed was savage even by Roman standards. The historian Tacitus, no friend to the Christians, recorded with evident distaste how Nero had believers sewn into animal skins and torn apart by dogs, or covered in pitch and burned alive to serve as human torches for his garden parties. It was in Nero's circus on the Vatican Hill that many of these martyrdoms took place, the sandy floor of the racing track drinking in the blood of those who died for their faith. Among those who perished in this persecution, according to ancient Christian tradition, was Simon Peter, the Galilean fisherman whom Jesus had designated as the rock upon which he would build his church. Peter had come to Rome to lead the Christian community there, bringing the message of his master to the very heart of the empire that would one day embrace and transform that message. The exact circumstances of his death remain shrouded in legend, but tradition holds that he was crucified upside down at his own request, feeling unworthy to die in the same manner as his Lord. The site of Peter's martyrdom and burial became immediately sacred to the Christian community of Rome. Despite the danger of continued persecution, they would gather secretly at his tomb, located in a necropolis, a city of the dead that stretched along the northern side of the Vatican Hill. This cemetery, where pagans and Christians were buried side by side, became a place of pilgrimage for believers who risked their lives to pray at the grave of the man they considered the first leader of their church. For nearly 2.5 centuries, Christianity remained an illegal religion in the Roman Empire, subject to periodic waves of persecution that ranged from local harassment to empire-wide attempts at eradication. Yet the faith continued to spread, finding converts among slaves and senators alike, its message of salvation and eternal life resonating with those who found little hope in the traditional gods of Rome. The Vatican Hill, sanctified by the blood of martyrs, remained a focal point for Roman Christians, even as they were forced to worship in house churches and hidden catacombs. The Great Transformation began with a battle fought far from Rome at the Milvian Bridge, spanning the Tiber north of the city. On October 28, 312 AD, Constantine faced his rival Maxentius for control of the Western Roman Empire. According to later Christian historians, Constantine saw a vision before the battle, either a cross of light in the sky or a dream of Christ himself, accompanied by the words, "In this sign, conquer." Constantine ordered his soldiers to paint the Chi, the first 2 letters of Christ's name in Greek, on their shields. Constantine's victory at the Milvian Bridge changed not just the fate of the Roman Empire, but the entire trajectory of Western civilization. The following year, he issued the Edict of Milan, granting religious tolerance throughout the empire and ending the persecution of Christians. More than mere tolerance, Constantine showed active favor to the faith, returning confiscated property to Christian communities and embarking on an ambitious program of church construction throughout his domains. The Vatican Hill, so long associated with martyrdom and secret worship, was about to undergo its most dramatic transformation yet. Constantine, whether out of genuine piety or political calculation, decided to build a great basilica over the tomb of St. Peter. This was no simple undertaking, as the site presented enormous engineering challenges. The tomb lay on the side of a hill, requiring massive earthworks to create a level platform for the church. Moreover, the necropolis was still in use, and Roman law strictly protected burial sites from desecration. Constantine's builders solved these problems with characteristic Roman efficiency and disregard for obstacles. They filled in the cemetery, carefully preserving Peter's tomb while burying the surrounding graves under tons of earth and rubble. Massive retaining walls were constructed to hold back the hillside, creating a vast artificial platform upon which the basilica would rise. The engineering feat rivaled anything the Romans had attempted in their long history of monumental construction. The basilica that rose from these foundations was unlike any church that had been built before. Constantine's architects drew inspiration from Roman civic basilicas, those great halls where law courts and public business were conducted, rather than from pagan temples. The building stretched over 300 feet in length, with 5 aisles separated by columns plundered from earlier Roman monuments. The central nave soared to a height of over 100 feet, its walls pierced by windows that flooded the interior with light. At the western end of the basilica, directly over Peter's tomb, Constantine built a special shrine called the Trophy of Gaius, named after a Roman priest who had described the monument in the 2nd century. This shrine, decorated with precious metals and gems, became the spiritual center not just of the basilica, but of the entire Christian world. Pilgrims would travel thousands of miles to pray at this spot, believing that Peter's presence somehow lingered there, interceding for them before the throne of God. The construction of Old St. Peter's Basilica, as it would later be known to distinguish it from its Renaissance successor, took over 3 decades to complete. During this time, the area around the church began to transform from a suburban cemetery into a thriving Christian quarter. Monasteries sprang up to house the monks who served the basilica and cared for the pilgrims who came in ever-increasing numbers. Hostels were built to accommodate these travelers, along with shops selling religious souvenirs and supplies for the journey home. The Bishop of Rome, who claimed succession from Peter himself, naturally took a special interest in the basilica built over the Apostles' tomb. Though the bishops continued to reside at the Lateran Palace on the opposite side of the city, which Constantine had also donated to the church, they would regularly process to St. Peter's for important celebrations. These liturgical journeys across Rome became public spectacles that reinforced the bishop's growing authority over the Christian community. As the 4th century progressed, the bishops of Rome began to assert their primacy over other Christian leaders, basing their claims on their succession from Peter, to whom Christ had given the keys to the kingdom of heaven. This assertion was not universally accepted, particularly in the eastern parts of the empire where the bishops of Constantinople, Alexandria, and Antioch wielded considerable influence. Yet the possession of Peter's tomb gave Rome a tangible connection to the apostolic age that no other city could match. The theological disputes that racked the early church often centered on the nature of Christ himself. Was he truly God, as the Council of Nicaea declared in 325, or was he a created being, as the Arians claimed? These debates might seem abstract to modern minds, but they had profound political implications in an empire where religious unity was seen as essential to political stability. The bishops of Rome generally sided with Orthodox Christology, enhancing their reputation as defenders of true doctrine. Pope Damasus I, who ruled from 366 to 384, undertook significant improvements to the Vatican Basilica and its surroundings. He commissioned his secretary, the scholar Jerome, who would later translate the Bible into Latin, to create elegant inscriptions for the tombs of martyrs throughout Rome. At St. Peter's, Damasus installed a new altar over the Apostles' tomb and regularized the liturgy performed there, establishing traditions that would endure for centuries. The relationship between the papacy and imperial power grew increasingly complex as the 4th century drew to a close. While the emperors had legalized and favored Christianity, they also expected to exercise control over the church, convening councils and sometimes attempting to dictate doctrine. The bishops of Rome had to navigate these treacherous waters carefully, maintaining their independence while not alienating their imperial protectors. Pope Leo I, who assumed the papal throne in 440, emerged as one of the most significant figures in establishing papal authority. His theological writings earned him the title the Great, but his most dramatic moment came in 452 when he rode out from Rome to meet Attila the Hun, who was ravaging northern Italy. The details of their conversation remain unknown, but Attila withdrew without attacking Rome, an event that enhanced Leo's prestige as a protector of the city and its people. 3 years later, Leo could not repeat this miracle when the Vandals sailed up the Tiber to sack Rome. However, he did negotiate with their leader Genseric to limit the destruction, preventing the burning of churches and the massacre of civilians. The Vatican Basilica survived these turbulent times, its treasures hidden or carried away by fleeing clerics, but its structure intact, a symbol of continuity in an age of chaos. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 created a power vacuum in Italy that the papacy would gradually fill. With no emperor in the West and the Eastern emperors in Constantinople focused on their own problems, the bishops of Rome found themselves not just spiritual leaders, but also temporal authorities, responsible for feeding the population, maintaining public works, and negotiating with the various barbarian kingdoms that had carved up the former empire. The Vatican area during this period began to develop its own identity, separate from the city of Rome proper. While still outside the ancient walls, it had become a distinct Christian quarter, centered on the Great Basilica. Pilgrims from the newly converted barbarian kingdoms of Europe would make their way to Peter's tomb, bringing offerings that enriched the church and stories that spread the fame of the Apostolic See throughout the former Roman world. The liturgical life of St. Peter's became increasingly elaborate during the 5th century. The papal masses celebrated there on major feast days were theatrical spectacles designed to inspire awe and devotion. The Pope would arrive in procession, accompanied by the entire Roman clergy, while choirs sang ancient hymns in Latin and Greek. Incense filled the air, and candlelight reflected off the golden mosaics that decorated the apse, creating an atmosphere that transported worshippers from the mundane world into a foretaste of heavenly glory. The intellectual life of the Vatican also flourished during this period. The papal library, which would eventually become one of the world's great repositories of knowledge, began as a modest collection of biblical texts and theological treatises housed near St. Peter's. Monks labored in scriptoriums, copying manuscripts by hand, preserving not just Christian writings, but also classical texts that might otherwise have been lost to history. As the 5th century gave way to the 6th, the Vatican had completed its transformation from a pagan cemetery and imperial pleasure garden into the spiritual heart of Western Christianity. The wild hill where Etruscan priests once watched for omens had become the site where the successor of Peter claimed the authority to bind and loose on earth and in heaven. The circus where Christians had died for their faith now lay buried beneath a magnificent basilica where emperors and kings would come to kneel before the papal throne. Yet this was only the beginning of the Vatican's story. The centuries ahead would bring invasions and reforms, corruption and sanctity, architectural marvels, and political intrigue. The small Christian quarter around St. Peter's tomb would grow into a sovereign state, the smallest in the world, yet one of the most influential. The bishops of Rome would crown emperors and excommunicate kings, commission the greatest art of the Renaissance, and condemn the discoveries of modern science, always from this sacred ground sanctified by the blood of martyrs and the bones of the apostle. The collapse of imperial authority in the West during the late 5th century left Rome exposed to waves of barbarian incursions that fundamentally altered the character of the Eternal City. The Ostrogoths under Theodoric established their kingdom in Italy, ruling from Ravenna, while maintaining an uneasy relationship with the Roman population and its bishop. The Vatican Basilica continued to function as a pilgrimage site, though the streams of visitors slowed to a trickle as travel became increasingly dangerous and the former Roman roads fell into disrepair. The Gothic Wars that erupted in 535 brought unprecedented devastation to Italy as the Byzantine Emperor Justinian sought to reconquer the Western territories. For 20 years, armies swept back and forth across the peninsula, besieging cities, destroying agricultural infrastructure, and reducing the population through warfare, famine, and disease. Rome itself changed hands multiple times, each siege and capture further diminishing its population and destroying its ancient monuments. During one particularly brutal siege in 546, the Gothic king Totila cut the aqueducts that had supplied Rome with fresh water for nearly 1,000 years. the population fled, and for several weeks the Eternal City stood empty, inhabited only by wild animals that roamed through the deserted forums and basilicas. Though St. Peter's survived these calamities, many of its treasures were looted or hidden, and the community of monks who served the basilica was scattered. Into this chaos stepped one of the most remarkable figures in papal history, Gregory, who would earn the title the Great through his transformation of the papacy from a primarily religious institution into a temporal power. Born around 540 into a wealthy Roman senatorial family, Gregory had pursued a traditional administrative career, rising to become prefect of Rome before renouncing worldly honors to become a monk. He converted his family palace on the Caelian Hill into a monastery, and might have spent his remaining days in contemplation had not circumstances forced him onto a larger stage. Pope Pelagius II recognized Gregory's administrative talents and appointed him as papal ambassador to Constantinople, where he spent 6 years attempting to secure military aid for Italy against the Lombards, a new Germanic people who had invaded from the north. Though unsuccessful in his diplomatic mission, Gregory gained invaluable experience in dealing with imperial bureaucracy and understanding the limitations of Byzantine power in the West. When Pelagius died in 590 as plague ravaged Rome, the clergy and people unanimously elected Gregory as his successor despite his attempts to avoid the office. According to legend, he even tried to flee the city hidden in a basket, but was discovered and brought back to be consecrated. His reluctance was understandable, as he inherited a desperate situation with Rome surrounded by hostile Lombards, its population decimated by plague, and its civic infrastructure in ruins. Gregory approached these challenges with remarkable energy and innovation. Recognizing that he could expect no help from Constantinople, he took upon himself responsibilities that had traditionally belonged to civil authorities. He organized the distribution of grain from the papal estates in Sicily, which had escaped the worst devastation of the wars. He negotiated directly with the Lombard dukes, sometimes paying them tribute from church funds to spare Roman territory. He appointed governors to towns under papal control and maintained a militia to defend against raids. The administrative structure Gregory created to manage these temporal affairs would endure for over 1,000 years. He reorganized the papal estates, called patrimonia, scattered throughout Italy, Sicily, and North Africa, appointing rectors to oversee their management and ensure regular revenue flowed to Rome. These estates not only supported the clergy but also funded charitable works, maintaining hospitals, feeding the poor, and ransoming captives from barbarian raiders. Gregory's vision extended far beyond the immediate crisis facing Rome. He understood that the future of Christianity lay not in the declining Mediterranean world, but in the barbarian kingdoms of northern Europe. He initiated missionary efforts to convert the Anglo-Saxons in Britain, sending a group of monks led by Augustine to establish the church in Kent. This mission's success would eventually create a network of monasteries and churches that looked to Rome for guidance, extending papal influence into regions the Caesars had never conquered. The liturgical reforms Gregory implemented at St. Peter's and throughout the Roman Church standardized worship practices that spread throughout the Western Church. The Gregorian chant, though probably not invented by Gregory himself, was systematized during his pontificate, creating a musical tradition that would define Western sacred music for centuries. He established the practice of stational liturgies, where the Pope would celebrate Mass at different churches throughout Rome on specific days, reinforcing his presence throughout the city. Gregory's extensive writings, including his Pastoral Care, a manual for bishops, and his dialogues featuring stories of Italian saints, became foundational texts for medieval Christianity. His correspondence, over 800 letters survive, reveals a mind engaged with every aspect of church governance, from theological disputes to the management of agricultural estates. He wrote with equal care to emperors and peasants, demonstrating a pastoral concern that earned him genuine devotion from those under his authority. The transformation Gregory initiated continued under his successors, though none matched his particular combination of sanctity and administrative genius. The 7th century saw the papacy increasingly caught between the Byzantine Empire, which still claimed sovereignty over Italy, and the Lombard kingdom, which controlled most of the peninsula. The popes maintained a delicate balance, nominally acknowledging imperial authority while acting with increasing independence in practical matters. The situation grew more complex when Byzantine emperors began promoting theological positions that the Roman Church considered heretical. The monothelite controversy, which claimed Christ had only one will despite having two natures, created a rift between Rome and Constantinople that went beyond theology to challenge papal authority itself. Pope Martin III convened a synod at the Lateran in 649 that condemned monothelitism, directly defying imperial edicts supporting the doctrine. The imperial response was swift and brutal. Emperor Constans II ordered Martin arrested and brought to Constantinople, where he was tried for treason, deposed, and exiled to the Crimea, where he died in 655. This martyrdom of a pope by a Christian emperor shocked the Western Church and reinforced the growing sense that Rome could not rely on Byzantine protection. The Vatican Basilica, where prayers were offered for the suffering pope, became a symbol of resistance to imperial tyranny. The 8th century brought new challenges and unexpected opportunities. The Lombards, growing more aggressive, threatened to finally conquer Rome itself. The Byzantine Empire, weakened by Arab conquests and internal strife, could offer no assistance. Pope Gregory II faced demands from Emperor Leo III to support iconoclasm, the destruction of religious images which the Roman Church vehemently opposed. When Gregory refused, Leo attempted to have him arrested, but the Roman militia and population rallied to defend their bishop. This popular support demonstrated how completely the papacy had assumed leadership of Rome and central Italy. The pope was no longer just a spiritual leader, but the de facto ruler of a territory that would become known as the patrimony of St. Peter. The Vatican, as the site of Peter's Basilica, stood at the symbolic heart of this emerging papal state, though the popes continued to reside primarily at the Lateran Palace. The decisive transformation came through an alliance with a new power rising in the north. The Frankish kingdom under the Carolingian dynasty had emerged as the strongest of the barbarian successor states. These Frankish rulers, particularly Charles Martel, who had defeated the Muslim invasion at Tours in 732, represented a potential counterweight to both Lombard aggression and Byzantine weakness. Pope Gregory III first attempted to forge this alliance, sending ambassadors to Charles Martel with keys to St. Peter's tomb and an offer to break with the Byzantine Empire in favor of Frankish protection. Though Charles declined, perhaps wary of entanglement in Italian affairs, the precedent was set for future cooperation. The keys to St. Peter's tomb had become diplomatic instruments, physical tokens of spiritual authority that popes would use to legitimize political arrangements. The crisis came to a head under Pope Stephen II when the Lombard king Aistulf conquered Ravenna, the last major Byzantine stronghold in northern Italy, and demanded tribute from Rome. Stephen undertook an unprecedented journey, crossing the Alps in winter to personally appeal to Pepin the Short, who had recently become king of the Franks with papal blessing. This meeting at Ponthion in 754 changed the course of European history. Pepin agreed to intervene in Italy not as a conqueror, but as a protector of St. Peter and his successors. He defeated the Lombards and, in an act of remarkable generosity or calculated politics, donated the conquered territories not to the Byzantine Empire, their nominal owner, but to St. Peter and the Roman Church. This donation of Pepin created the legal foundation for the Papal States, transforming the Pope from a Roman bishop with scattered estates into a territorial sovereign. The document confirming this donation was solemnly placed on St. Peter's tomb in the Vatican Basilica, symbolically making the apostle himself the recipient of these lands. This gesture brilliantly merged spiritual and temporal authority, suggesting that opposition to papal rule was not merely political rebellion but sacrilege against the Prince of the Apostles. The Vatican thus became not just a pilgrimage site, but the symbolic capital of an earthly kingdom claimed in the name of heaven. Papine's son Charles, known to history as Charlemagne, would expand this relationship into something unprecedented. His conquests created a Frankish empire stretching from the Pyrenees to the Elbe, from the North Sea to central Italy. Unlike his father, Charlemagne saw himself not merely as a protector of the papacy, but as a partner in governing Christendom. He visited Rome 4 times, each visit reinforcing the alliance between Frankish military power and papal spiritual authority. The most dramatic of these visits occurred in 800, when Charlemagne came to Rome to investigate charges against Pope Leo III, who had been attacked and briefly deposed by Roman nobles. After Leo cleared himself of the accusations through an oath at St. Peter's altar, an elaborate Christmas Mass was arranged at the Basilica. As Charlemagne rose from prayer at Peter's tomb, Leo suddenly placed a crown on his head, while the assembled clergy and people acclaimed him as emperor. This coronation, whether spontaneous or carefully orchestrated, created the Holy Roman Empire and established a precedent that would shape European politics for 1,000 years. The Pope had assumed the power to transfer imperial authority, making the Vatican Basilica the site where temporal power received divine sanction. Yet the act also created an inherent tension, as it remained unclear whether the emperor derived his authority from God directly or through papal mediation. The Carolingian Renaissance that Charlemagne sponsored brought new prosperity to Rome and the Vatican. Scholars from across Europe came to study in the papal libraries and scriptoriums. The Schola Cantorum at St. Peter's became a center for musical innovation, developing polyphonic singing that added complexity to the traditional Gregorian chants. Pilgrimage increased dramatically as Charlemagne's empire provided the security necessary for long-distance travel. The Vatican began to develop more elaborate facilities to accommodate these pilgrims. Hostels operated by different national groups sprang up around St. Peter's, creating distinct quarters where English, Frankish, Frisian, and Saxon visitors could find lodging and companions who spoke their language. These national scholai, as they were called, maintained their own chapels within the basilica and competed in displaying devotion through elaborate liturgies and generous donations. The wealth flowing into St. Peter's from across Europe funded ambitious building projects. Pope Hadrian Maestai undertook extensive repairs to the basilica, replacing the wooden roof with tiles and adding new mosaics to the facade. He also began constructing a covered portico connecting the Vatican to the Castel Sant'Angelo, the ancient mausoleum of Hadrian that had been converted into a fortress. This structure would prove its worth in the turbulent centuries ahead. The death of Charlemagne in 814 began a long decline in Carolingian power that left the papacy increasingly vulnerable. His empire fragmented among quarreling descendants, while new threats emerged from every direction. Viking longships appeared at the mouth of the Tiber, Muslim pirates established bases on the Italian coast, and Magyar horsemen raided from the east. The papal state, lacking significant military forces of its own, struggled to defend its territories. The nadir came on August 23, 846, when a Muslim fleet sailed up the Tiber and attacked Rome itself. The city walls held, but St. Peter's and St. Paul's basilicas, both outside the fortifications, lay defenseless. The raiders plundered both churches, stripping them of centuries of accumulated treasures. They tore down the silver plates covering St. Peter's tomb, stole the golden cross that Constantine had placed above it, and carried away countless chalices, candlesticks, and gospel books adorned with precious stones. The psychological impact exceeded even the material losses. St. Peter's tomb, the foundation of papal authority, had been violated by infidels. The humiliation sparked a remarkable response from Pope Leo IV, who organized the construction of new walls around the Vatican area, creating what became known as the Leonine City. These massive fortifications, completed in just 4 years through the labor of corvée workers from across the Papal States, enclosed St. Peter's, the papal palace that was beginning to develop near the Basilica, and the surrounding Borgo. The construction of the Leonine walls marked a crucial transition in Vatican history. What had been an open pilgrimage site was now a fortified enclave, a physical manifestation of the Church's need to defend itself in an increasingly violent world. Gates controlled access, guards patrolled the walls, and the area within became a distinct administrative unit with its own governance. The Vatican was evolving from a sacred space into a sovereign territory. Leo IV also organized a naval league with the maritime cities of Naples, Gaeta, and Amalfi to combat Muslim piracy. In 849, this combined fleet defeated a Muslim force at the Battle of Ostia, a victory commemorated in Raphael's famous fresco in the Vatican Palace. The Pope personally blessed the Christian fleet before battle, demonstrating how completely the papacy had assumed the role of military leadership in central Italy. The fortification of the Vatican coincided with an elaboration of papal ceremonial that emphasized the Pope's unique status as successor of Peter. The coronation ritual for new popes became increasingly complex, involving a procession from the Lateran to St. Peter's, where the new pontiff would be invested with the pallium, a woolen stole symbolizing pastoral authority taken from Peter's tomb itself. This physical connection to the apostle reinforced claims of continuity stretching back to Christ himself. The papal court that developed during the 9th century began to resemble the imperial courts it claimed to supersede. Cardinals, originally priests assigned to specific Roman churches, evolved into a college of advisors and administrators. The papal chancery developed sophisticated procedures for issuing documents using distinctive scripts and lead seals called bulls to authenticate papal decisions. The Vatican became not just a religious center but an administrative hub, managing correspondence with churches throughout Europe. Yet this increasing worldliness contained the seeds of corruption that would nearly destroy the papacy in the century to come. The office of Pope, with its temporal wealth and political power, became a prize fought over by Roman noble families. The spiritual mission that had motivated Gregory the Great seemed increasingly secondary to the maintenance of territorial control and the accumulation of wealth. The Vatican Basilica, built over the tomb of a fisherman who had owned nothing, now glittered with gold while rival factions schemed to control its treasures. The Carolingian Empire's final collapse in 888 removed the last external check on Roman aristocratic ambition. The papacy entered what historians would later call the Saeculum Obscurum, the Dark Age, when the throne of St. Peter became the plaything of powerful families like the Theophylacti and Crescenti. The Vatican witnessed scenes that would have horrified earlier generations of Christians as popes were murdered, deposed, and replaced with shocking regularity. This crisis of legitimacy threatened to destroy papal authority entirely. Yet the institution survived, protected partly by the reverence for St. Peter that prevented complete destruction and partly by the practical need for some central authority in the fragmented world of post-Carolingian Europe. The Vatican remained a destination for pilgrims who came to pray at Peter's tomb regardless of the unworthiness of his current successor. These pilgrims, bearing offerings and carrying stories back to their homelands, maintained the international character of the papacy even during its darkest period. The approach of the year 1000 brought millennial anxieties but also hope for renewal. Many Christians expected the world to end with the millennium, leading to increased pilgrimage to Rome and lavish donations to St. Peter's by those hoping to secure salvation before the final judgment. When the world did not end, there was a sense of new beginning, an opportunity to reform the corrupted institutions of Christendom. That reform would come from unexpected sources, as movements beginning in monasteries far from Rome would eventually transform the papacy itself. The Vatican, which had witnessed the transformation of a cemetery into the capital of a spiritual empire, would now become the center of a revolutionary attempt to separate spiritual authority from temporal corruption. The age of papal monarchy was about to begin, bringing both the greatest triumphs and the most serious challenges the Roman Church had yet faced. The dawn of the 10th century found the papacy in the grip of what later historians would term the pornocracy, a period when the papal throne was controlled by a powerful Roman family through a remarkable woman named Marozia. She was the daughter of Theophylact, a Roman consul who had made himself master of the city, and his wife Theodora, who wielded influence through strategic alliances and, according to hostile chroniclers, through romantic liaisons with powerful churchmen. The Vatican during these years became a stage for political intrigue and moral scandal that seemed to mock everything the Basilica of St. Peter represented. Marozia herself became the mistress of Pope Sergius III when she was just 15, bearing him a son who would one day become Pope John V. Through a series of marriages to powerful nobles and her own political acumen, she effectively controlled the papacy for 3 decades, installing and deposing popes according to her will. The sacred spaces of the Vatican witnessed conspiracies hatched in whispered conversations, while the tombs of martyrs looked down upon scenes of worldly ambition that would have appalled earlier generations of believers. The spiritual degradation reached its nadir with Pope John V, who ascended to the throne of Peter in 955 at the age of 18. The grandson of Marozia, he treated the papacy as a personal possession to fund his extravagant lifestyle. Contemporary chronicles, though possibly exaggerated by hostile writers, describe him turning the Lateran palace into a brothel, toasting the devil during drinking bouts, and invoking pagan gods while gambling. Pilgrims arriving at St. Peter's found a church where sacred vessels were sold to pay debts, and where the Pope himself showed more interest in hunting than in celebrating Mass. Yet even in this dark period, the idea of papal authority retained its power. John III, despite his personal unworthiness, made a decision that would profoundly shape European history when he crowned Otto I of Germany as Holy Roman Emperor in St. Peter's Basilica in 962. Otto had answered the Pope's call for protection against local enemies, but once crowned, he proved to be master rather than servant. When John tried to assert his independence by negotiating with Otto's enemies, the emperor marched back to Rome, convened a synod at St. Peter's, and had John deposed for a litany of crimes including murder, adultery, and sacrilege. The pattern established by Otto would persist for centuries, with German emperors claiming the right to confirm or reject papal elections. This intervention, humiliating though it was to Roman pride, actually helped preserve the papacy from complete dissolution into local Roman politics. The emperors needed legitimate popes to validate their own authority, creating a paradoxical situation where foreign domination protected the universal character of the papal office. The reform movement that would transform the medieval church began not in Rome, but in the monastery of Cluny in Burgundy, founded in 910 with a charter that placed it directly under papal authority, free from interference by local bishops or nobles. The Cluniac monks developed a vision of Christian society where spiritual authority, emanating from Rome, would guide temporal powers rather than be subjected to them. This idea spread through a network of monasteries across Europe, creating a constituency for papal reform that transcended local politics. The catalyst for change came with the election of Pope Leo IX in 1049, a relative of the German emperor, but also a genuine reformer influenced by Cluniac ideals. Leo transformed the papacy from a Roman institution into a truly international one by traveling extensively throughout Europe, holding reforming councils and appointing reformers from outside Rome to key positions. He brought to Rome a young monk named Hildebrand, who would become the architect of papal revolution. Leo also precipitated the permanent rupture between Eastern and Western Christianity through his confrontation with the Patriarch of Constantinople. The issues dividing the churches were complex, involving theological disputes over the nature of the Trinity, liturgical differences, and competing claims to jurisdiction. But the breaking point came in 1054 when papal legates, led by Cardinal Humbert, marched into the Hagia Sophia during the Divine Liturgy and placed a bull of excommunication on the altar. The Patriarch Michael Cerularius responded with his own excommunication of the papal legates, creating a schism that would never be healed. The Vatican's claim to universal authority over all Christians was now definitively rejected by the Eastern churches, limiting papal power to the Western world, but also freeing the popes from the need to accommodate Byzantine sensibilities. The Roman Church could now develop its own distinctive character, without reference to Constantinople. Hildebrand, who took the name Gregory VII when elected pope in 1073, launched what historians call the Gregorian Reform, a revolutionary program that sought to establish the complete independence and supremacy of spiritual authority. His Dictatus Papae, a list of 27 propositions about papal power, claimed that the Pope alone could depose emperors, that all princes should kiss his feet, and that the Roman Church had never erred and never would err. These were not new claims entirely, but Gregory pursued them with unprecedented determination. The conflict came to a head over the issue of investiture, the practice by which secular rulers appointed bishops and abbots, investing them with the symbols of their office. Gregory condemned this practice as simony, the buying and selling of spiritual offices, and ordered excommunication for any cleric who received investiture from lay hands. This struck at the heart of medieval governance, where bishops were not just spiritual leaders but also territorial princes essential to royal administration. Emperor Henry IV of Germany initially submitted to papal demands, but when Gregory supported rebellious German princes, Henry convened a synod that declared Gregory deposed. Gregory responded by excommunicating Henry and releasing his subjects from their oaths of allegiance, a spiritual weapon with devastating political consequences. Faced with rebellion, Henry made his famous journey to Canossa in 1077, where he stood barefoot in the snow for 3 days before Gregory granted him absolution. The humiliation at Canossa seemed to demonstrate papal supremacy over imperial power, but the conflict was far from over. Henry later captured Rome and installed an antipope, forcing Gregory to flee to Salerno, where he died in exile, reportedly saying, "I have loved justice and hated iniquity, therefore I die in exile." Yet Gregory's ideas survived and triumphed, fundamentally altering the relationship between spiritual and temporal authority in Western civilization. The First Crusade, launched by Pope Urban II in 1095, demonstrated the papacy's new power to mobilize European society for religious ends. Urban's call at Clermont for Christians to liberate the Holy Land from Muslim control met with extraordinary response. Knights who had spent their lives fighting each other suddenly united under the banner of the cross, acknowledging papal authority to direct their military efforts towards spiritual goals. The conquest of Jerusalem in 1099 seemed to validate papal leadership of Christendom. The 12th century witnessed the emergence of the papal monarchy, with the Pope functioning not just as a spiritual leader but as a supreme judge and legislator for all of Christian Europe. The Vatican developed increasingly sophisticated administrative structures to manage this expanded role. The papal chancery became the busiest writing office in Europe, producing thousands of letters and legal decisions annually. Canon law, systematized in Gratian's Decretum, provided a comprehensive legal framework that competed with and often superseded secular law codes. Pope Innocent III, who reigned from 1198 to 1216, represented the apex of papal power. A brilliant lawyer and theologian, he intervened decisively in the affairs of every European kingdom. He excommunicated King John of England, forcing him to surrender his kingdom to the papacy and receive it back as a fief. He deposed Emperor Otto IV and determined the succession to the imperial throne. He launched the Fourth Crusade, which notoriously ended with the sack of Constantinople, and authorized the Albigensian Crusade against heretics in southern France. The Fourth Lateran Council, convened by Innocent in 1215 at the Lateran Basilica, was the largest gathering in medieval Europe, with over 400 bishops and 800 abbots attending. The council's decrees regulated every aspect of Christian life, from the obligation of annual confession to the requirement that Jews wear distinctive clothing. The doctrine of transubstantiation was formally defined, asserting that the bread and wine of the Eucharist literally become the body and blood of Christ, a mystery renewed daily in every church, but originating from the Last Supper commemorated at St. Peter's tomb. Innocent transformed the Vatican into a true center of world government. Envoys from every corner of Europe waited in anterooms for papal audiences. The papal court, or curia, developed specialized departments handling different aspects of church governance. The apostolic penitentiary dealt with matters of conscience and absolution. The rota functioned as a Supreme Court hearing appeals from throughout Christendom, and the Camera Apostolica managed the vast financial resources flowing to Rome from every Christian land. The mendicant orders founded during this period, the Franciscans and Dominicans, provided the papacy with a new instrument of influence. Unlike traditional monks tied to specific monasteries, these friars traveled freely, preaching, teaching, and serving as papal agents throughout Europe. They established schools and universities that trained a new generation of clerics loyal to Rome rather than to local bishops or secular rulers. The intellectual flowering of scholasticism, culminating in the work of Thomas Aquinas, provided sophisticated theological justification for papal supremacy. Yet the very success of the papal monarchy contained seeds of its own crisis. The wealth flowing into Rome funded magnificent building projects but also fostered corruption. The Vatican Palace expanded into a complex of buildings housing not just the papal administration, but also the luxurious apartments of cardinals and their extensive retinues. Nepotism became endemic, with popes appointing relatives to lucrative positions regardless of qualifications. The spiritual mission that had motivated the Gregorian reformers seemed increasingly subordinated to political and financial concerns. The conflict between Pope Boniface VIII and King Philip IV of France at the end of the 13th century revealed the limits of papal power when confronted by emerging national monarchies. Philip, needing funds for his wars, taxed the French clergy despite canonical prohibitions. Boniface responded with the bull Unam Sanctum in 1302, the most extreme statement of papal supremacy ever issued, declaring that submission to the Roman pontiff was absolutely necessary for salvation. Philip's response was brutally direct. He sent armed men to arrest Boniface at Anagni, and though local townspeople freed the Pope after 3 days, the elderly pontiff died shortly afterward, reportedly of shock and humiliation. The age of papal monarchy was ending, not through theological debate, but through the raw application of military force by secular rulers no longer willing to accept clerical supremacy. The election of Clement V, a Frenchman subservient to Philip, marked the beginning of what would be called the Babylonian captivity of the papacy. In 1309, Clement moved the papal court to Avignon in southern France, abandoning Rome and the Vatican for what was intended as a temporary relocation, but would last nearly 70 years. St. Peter's Basilica, the symbolic heart of papal authority, was left to decay while French popes built a magnificent palace in Avignon. The absence of the popes from Rome had profound psychological and practical consequences. Pilgrims arriving at St. Peter's found grass growing through cracks in the floor, and rain dripping through holes in the roof. The Roman noble families resumed their violent feuds without papal authority to restrain them. The city that had claimed to be Caput Mundi, the head of the world, became a provincial backwater, its population shrinking as economic activity collapsed. Petrarch, the great Italian poet, wrote passionate letters urging the popes to return to their rightful seat, comparing Avignon to Babylon and Rome to the widowed Jerusalem of Lamentations. Saint Catherine of Siena, a Dominican mystic, travelled to Avignon to personally confront Gregory XV, telling him that she could smell the stench of hell in the papal court. Her appeals, combined with the deteriorating political situation in France, finally convinced Gregory to return to Rome in 1377. But the papacy's troubles were far from over. Gregory's death shortly after his return led to the election of Urban VI, an Italian whose erratic behavior quickly alienated the cardinals. They declared his election invalid and chose a new pope, Clement VII, who returned to Avignon. Europe now faced the scandal of two rival popes, each claiming to be the legitimate successor of Peter, each excommunicating the other and their respective supporters. The Great Western Schism that resulted divided Europe along political lines, with France and its allies supporting the Avignon Pope, while most of Italy, Germany, and England recognized the Roman claimant. The spiritual authority of the papacy, built up over centuries, crumbled as Christians were forced to choose between competing claims to divine mandate. Some theologians began to argue that a general council representing the entire church held authority superior to any pope, a theory that would have been unthinkable during the height of papal monarchy. The situation became even more complex when cardinals from both obediences convened the Council of Pisa in 1409, deposing both existing popes and electing a third. Now there were three claimants to the papal throne, each maintaining his own court and claiming the allegiance of different parts of Europe. The Vatican itself became a fortress held by whichever faction could maintain military control of Rome, while rival popes hurled anathemas at each other from their respective strongholds. The resolution finally came at the Council of Constance, convened in 1414 with the support of the Holy Roman Emperor. After complex negotiations and the resignation or deposition of all three claimants, the council elected Martin V in 1417, ending the schism but at tremendous cost to papal prestige. The conciliar movement that emerged from this crisis asserted that general councils, not the Pope alone, held supreme authority in the Church, a direct challenge to centuries of papal claims. Martin V returned to Rome in 1420 to find a city in ruins. The Vatican was uninhabitable, St. Peter's Basilica was on the verge of collapse, and the Roman population had dwindled to fewer than 20,000 souls. The work of restoration would require not just rebuilding physical structures, but also recovering the spiritual authority that had been so badly damaged by the schism. The papacy had survived its darkest hour, but it would emerge transformed, forced to accommodate new realities in a Europe increasingly resistant to universal claims of authority. The stage was set for the Renaissance, when the popes would attempt to restore their prestige through patronage of art and architecture on an unprecedented scale. The Vatican would be transformed from a medieval pilgrimage site into a showcase of human creativity, but this cultural flowering would coincide with new challenges to papal authority that would ultimately split Western Christianity permanently. The tomb of the fisherman would remain, but the united Christendom it had once symbolized was about to fragment beyond repair. The journey to Avignon in 1309 marked more than a mere geographical relocation of the papal court. As the papal entourage wound its way through the Alpine passes, leaving behind the sacred ground where Peter had died and countless martyrs had shed their blood, something fundamental shifted in the spiritual geography of Western Christianity. The tombs of the apostles could not be moved, the ancient basilicas could not be transported, and the accumulated sanctity of 1,000 years remained firmly rooted in Roman soil. Clement V established his court in Avignon, ostensibly as a temporary measure to escape the violent factional struggles of Roman noble families. The Dominican's priory, where he initially resided, soon proved inadequate for the elaborate bureaucracy that medieval papacy had become. Construction began on what would become the Palais des Papes, a fortress palace that combined Gothic grandeur with military practicality, its thick walls and towering battlements proclaiming that the successor of the fisherman now required protection worthy of any secular prince. The French kings, while never directly controlling the Avignon popes, exercised influence through proximity and pressure that would have been impossible had the papacy remained in Rome. The papal court became increasingly French in character, with French cardinals dominating the sacred college and French customs replacing Roman traditions. The liturgical calendar adapted to Provençal seasons rather than Roman ones, and the French language competed with Latin in curial corridors where Italian had once predominated. Financial innovation became necessary to maintain papal splendor without access to the traditional revenues of the papal states, which had fallen into chaos during the Pope's absence. John XXIII, who succeeded Clement in 1316, proved remarkably creative in developing new sources of income. He systematized the practice of reservations, claiming the right to appoint all benefices that fell vacant and demanding payment from those who received appointments. The sale of indulgences expanded dramatically, with papal partners traveling throughout Europe offering remission of temporal punishment for sin in exchange for monetary contributions. These financial practices, while filling papal coffers, corrupted the spiritual mission of the Church in ways that would have long-lasting consequences. Bishops paid enormous sums for their appointments and naturally sought to recover these investments through their own exactions from lower clergy and laity. The papal court at Avignon became notorious for its luxury, with banquets featuring dozens of courses, cardinals maintaining households of hundreds of servants, and gold flowing like water through the narrow streets of the Provençal city. The Black Death that swept through Europe in 1348 reached Avignon with particular virulence, killing perhaps half the city's population. Pope Clement VI, showing remarkable courage, remained in the city to provide spiritual comfort to the dying, purchasing a new cemetery to ensure proper burial for plague victims. He also issued bulls protecting Jews from massacre by those who blamed them for the pestilence, though his authority to enforce such protection was limited by his absence from the traditional seat of papal power. The plague's aftermath created both crisis and opportunity for the Avignon papacy. The massive mortality among clergy created countless vacant benefices that the popes claimed the right to fill, generating enormous revenues, but also resentment from local authorities who saw their traditional patronage rights usurped. The psychological impact of the plague, the sense that God was punishing humanity for its sins, created a spiritual hunger that the luxurious papal court seemed ill-equipped to address. Mystical movements flourished during this period, often implicitly or explicitly critical of papal worldliness. The spiritual Franciscans, who insisted on absolute poverty in imitation of Christ, and St. Francis, were declared heretical by John Mortiarski for challenging the Church's right to own property. The Beguines and Beghards, lay religious communities that sought direct spiritual experience without clerical mediation, were suppressed as threats to ecclesiastical authority. Yet these movements reflected a genuine desire for authentic spirituality that the Avignon papacy, for all its administrative efficiency, failed to satisfy. The return to Rome, when it finally came, was fraught with difficulty. Urban VI attempted to return in 1367, motivated by the appeals of St. Bridget of Sweden and the deteriorating situation in France during the 100 Years' War. He found Rome in ruins, with wolves roaming through the Vatican gardens, and St. Peter's Basilica so dilapidated that it was dangerous to enter. After 3 years of attempting restoration while facing constant rebellion from Roman nobles and the Papal States, Urban returned to Avignon, dying shortly after arrival. Gregory IV made the definitive return in 1377, but his death the following year precipitated the crisis that would nearly destroy the papacy. The Roman populace, fearing another French pope would return to Avignon, surrounded the conclave, demanding an Italian pope. The cardinals elected Urban VI, the Archbishop of Bari, but his erratic behavior and violent temper soon made them regret their choice. When Urban began planning to create enough Italian cardinals to outnumber the French, the existing cardinals fled Rome and declared his election invalid under duress. The schism that resulted was not merely an administrative dispute, but a profound spiritual crisis that struck at the heart of medieval Christianity's understanding of authority and legitimacy. If the Pope was Christ's vicar on earth, possessing the power to bind and loose granted to Peter, how could there be 2 or even 3 competing claims to this unique office? Theologians tied themselves in knots, trying to determine which claimant possessed valid authority, while ordinary Christians faced the terrible uncertainty of not knowing whether the sacraments they received were valid. The competing papal courts generated a propaganda war that further damaged ecclesiastical credibility. Each side produced elaborate legal arguments, historical precedents, and theological justifications for their position. Prophecies were manufactured or reinterpreted to support different claimants. The Roman Pope controlled St. Peter's tomb, that ultimate source of legitimacy, but the Avignon Pope commanded greater financial resources and French military support. The third Pope elected at Pisa added another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. The resolution achieved at Constance came at enormous cost to papal authority. The council's decree Haec Sancta declared that councils derived their authority directly from Christ, and that all Christians, including the Pope, must obey their decisions in matters of faith, unity, and reform. This conciliar theory, though later repudiated by the papacy, established a precedent that would resurface during the Protestant Reformation. The new Pope, Martin V, owed his position not to apostolic succession or divine designation, but to the decision of a church council. Martin V faced the Herculean task of rebuilding not just the physical structures of Rome, but the entire conceptual framework of papal authority. He approached this challenge with pragmatic intelligence, avoiding theoretical disputes about conciliar versus papal supremacy, while quietly reasserting traditional prerogatives. He negotiated concordats with various nations, acknowledging certain limits on papal power in exchange for recognition of his legitimacy. He also began the slow process of recovering control over the Papal States, whose revenues were essential for maintaining papal independence. The Rome that Martin entered in 1420 bore little resemblance to the eternal city of medieval imagination. The ancient aqueducts had long since failed, forcing residents to rely on polluted water from the Tiber. The forums were cow pastures, the Colosseum housed small workshops and hovels, and most of the great basilicas were approaching collapse. The Vatican itself was uninhabitable, its palace ransacked and its gardens overgrown. Martin established himself at first in the family palace of the Colonna, only gradually beginning the restoration of traditional papal residences. Yet Martin understood that physical restoration alone would not restore papal prestige. He encouraged humanist scholars to come to Rome, beginning the transformation of the papal court into a center of Renaissance learning. He commissioned paintings and sculptures that emphasized continuity with both classical antiquity and apostolic tradition. Most importantly, he proclaimed a Jubilee year for 1423, encouraging pilgrimage to Rome and the economic revival that pilgrims brought with them. The election of Nicholas V in 1447 marked the true beginning of the Renaissance papacy. A humanist scholar who had spent years in Florence absorbing the new learning, Nicholas conceived a grand vision of Rome reborn as a center of Christian culture that would surpass even its ancient glory, he assembled the finest minds of the age in the Vatican, creating a papal library that would preserve and disseminate both Christian and classical wisdom. His agents scoured monasteries throughout Europe for ancient manuscripts, while Greek scholars fleeing the advancing Ottomans brought texts unknown in the West for 1,000 years. Nicholas understood that architecture could serve as theology written in stone. He commissioned Fra Angelico to paint frescoes in the Vatican Palace, depicting scenes that linked papal authority to both biblical tradition and classical virtue. More ambitiously, he began planning the complete reconstruction of St. Peter's Basilica, recognizing that the ancient structure was beyond repair. Though he would not live to see this project realized, his vision would inspire his successors to create the greatest church in Christendom. The fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans in 1453 occurred during Nicholas's pontificate, marking the final end of the Byzantine Empire and leaving the Pope as the undisputed leader of Christianity in Western eyes. Nicholas attempted to organize a crusade to recover the city, but European powers were too divided by their own conflicts to respond. The failure revealed the limits of papal influence in an age of rising national monarchies, but it also eliminated the last institutional rival to Roman claims of Christian leadership. Sixtus IV, elected in 1471, combined religious devotion with family ambition in ways that epitomized both the glory and corruption of the Renaissance papacy. A Franciscan theologian of genuine learning, he also practiced nepotism on an unprecedented scale, appointing relatives to lucrative positions throughout the church hierarchy. 6 of his nephews became cardinals, while others received valuable benefices and secular lordships. This investment in family power would have profound consequences, as these papal nephews, or nepoti, used their positions to accumulate wealth and influence that outlasted their benefactor. The Sistine Chapel, Sixtus's most enduring legacy, was conceived as a fortress church that could serve as a final refuge if the Vatican were overrun. Its proportions deliberately echoed those of Solomon's temple as described in Scripture, asserting continuity between the Old Testament priesthood and the papal office. The original decoration, executed by the finest artists of the age including Botticelli, Perugino, and Ghirlandaio, depicted parallel scenes from the lives of Moses and Christ, with the clear implication that papal authority descended from both lawgiver and savior. The chapel's dedication ceremony in 1483 showcased the elaborate liturgy that had developed around the papal court. The Pope entered in procession wearing the triple tiara that symbolized his authority over church, world, and heaven. Cardinals in their scarlet robes represented the blood of martyrs, while the elaborate choreography of genuflections, incensations, and chanted responses created a sensory experience designed to overwhelm worshippers with the majesty of the church. The acoustic properties of the space, carefully calculated by its architects, gave the papal choir's polyphonic compositions an otherworldly quality. Yet beneath this cultural splendor lay political machinations that would have shocked earlier generations. Sixtus involved himself in the Papacy conspiracy to assassinate Lorenzo de' Medici, giving tacit approval to a plot that resulted in murder being committed during High Mass in Florence's cathedral. When the plot failed, Sixtus excommunicated the entire city of Florence for executing the conspirators, including an archbishop. Such use of spiritual weapons for temporal ends further eroded the moral authority that had once been the papacy's greatest strength. The transformation of Rome during this period was remarkable. Sixtus widened streets, built new bridges across the Tiber, and established the Vatican Library as a public institution available to scholars. He restored churches, commissioned fountains, and encouraged cardinals to build magnificent palaces that would enhance the city's prestige. The population began to recover, drawn by employment in construction and service to the expanding papal court. Pilgrims found improved accommodations and better maintained routes, to the major basilicas. This physical transformation reflected a fundamental shift in how the papacy understood its mission. Rather than the austere spiritual authority envisioned by Gregorian reformers, Renaissance popes saw themselves as princes who happened to be priests, competing with secular rulers in magnificence and power. They justified this worldliness by arguing that the Church's splendor gave glory to God and inspired faith in simple believers. Critics, however, saw corruption and betrayal of evangelical poverty. The invention of printing during this period created new opportunities and challenges for papal authority. Bulls and indulgences could be mass-produced, spreading papal messages more widely than ever before. But printing also enabled rapid dissemination of criticism and competing ideas. The papal attempt to control printing through censorship and licensing would ultimately fail, creating a new public sphere where papal pronouncements could be questioned and debated. Innocent VIII, who succeeded Sixtus, continued the pattern of mixing sacred and secular concerns. He became the first pope to openly acknowledge his illegitimate children, appointing them to profitable positions and arranging advantageous marriages. He allied with Naples against other Italian states, using excommunication and interdict as political weapons. Most bizarrely, he accepted custody of Prince Cem, brother of the Ottoman Sultan, maintaining him as a comfortable prisoner in the Vatican in exchange for payments from both the Sultan and Christian powers who hoped to use him against the Turks. The approach of the year 1500 brought apocalyptic expectations similar to those that had preceded the first millennium. Preachers throughout Europe proclaimed that the corruption of the Church signaled the coming of Antichrist and the end times. In Florence, the Dominican friar Savonarola denounced papal wickedness and called for church reform, establishing a brief theocratic republic before being excommunicated and burned as a heretic. His execution silenced one voice but not the underlying discontent with ecclesiastical corruption. The stage was set for the most notorious of Renaissance popes, Alexander VI, the Borgia Pope, whose reign would combine cultural achievement with moral scandal in ways that still shock historians. His election in 1492, achieved through bribery so blatant that mules loaded with silver were seen entering cardinals' palaces, marked a new low in papal corruption. Yet this same pope would commission some of the Vatican's greatest artistic treasures and play a crucial role in dividing the New World between Spain and Portugal. The Vatican had traveled far from its origins as a cemetery outside Rome's walls. What had begun as sacred ground sanctified by martyrs' blood had become the center of a complex institution combining spiritual authority, temporal power, and cultural patronage. The Renaissance papacy's achievements in art, architecture, and learning were undeniable, but they came at the cost of moral authority that would soon be challenged by reformers whose protests would split Western Christianity permanently. The tomb of the fisherman remained, but the simple faith he had preached seemed increasingly distant from the magnificence and corruption of his claimed successors. The election of Giuliano della Rovere as Pope Julius II in 1503 brought to the throne of Peter a man whose ambitions exceeded those of any pontiff since Innocent III. Known as the warrior pope for his personal leadership of military campaigns, Julius approached the papacy with the mindset of a Renaissance prince determined to restore both the territorial integrity of the papal states and the architectural grandeur of Rome. His vision would transform the Vatican from a medieval pilgrimage site into the architectural wonder that still amazes visitors 5 centuries later. Julius inherited a St. Peter's Basilica that was literally falling apart. The ancient structure, built by Constantine 1200 years earlier, had survived earthquakes, floods, sacks, and centuries of neglect, but time had finally conquered what enemies could not destroy. The south wall leaned outward at an alarming angle, held in place only by massive iron chains installed by Nicholas V. cracks spiderwebbed across the ceiling, and during heavy rains water poured through gaps in the roof, pooling on the sacred floor where countless pilgrims had knelt. Rather than attempting yet another renovation, Julius made the audacious decision to demolish the entire ancient basilica and build an entirely new church that would surpass any structure built since antiquity. This decision horrified traditionalists who saw it as sacrilege to destroy the church where Charlemagne had been crowned emperor and where generations of popes lay buried. The ancient columns that had witnessed the conversion of the Roman Empire would be reduced to rubble. The mosaics that had inspired medieval pilgrims would disappear forever. Julius entrusted this monumental project to Donato Bramante, an architect whose vision matched the Pope's ambition. Bramante designed a church based on a Greek cross plan, with 4 equal arms radiating from a central dome that would rival the Pantheon in scale and exceed it in height. The design represented a perfect fusion of Christian symbolism and Renaissance ideals of mathematical harmony, creating a structure that would proclaim both the glory of God and the genius of human creativity. The demolition began on April 18, 1506, with Julius himself removing the first stones from the tomb of Pope Julius III, his namesake from the 4th century. Workmen carefully dismantled the ancient altar over Peter's tomb, ensuring that the apostles' remains were not disturbed. As walls that had stood for more than a millennium came down, treasures were discovered and catalogued, including early Christian sarcophagi and inscriptions that provided invaluable historical evidence about the primitive church. The new construction required engineering innovations that pushed Renaissance technology to its limits. Bramante designed a system of massive piers to support the planned dome, each one larger than most entire churches of the period. The foundations alone required excavations deeper than any attempted since Roman times, and the amount of travertine needed exceeded the output of local quarries, requiring new ones to be opened. The logistics of transporting materials to the construction site transformed the Vatican area into a perpetual workshop, with armies of stonemasons, carpenters, and laborers creating a din that never ceased. While Bramante supervised the basilica's construction, Julius commissioned other projects that would make the Vatican a showcase of Renaissance art. He ordered a young sculptor named Michelangelo Buonarroti to create his tomb, envisioning a monument with 40 life-size statues that would surpass any funeral monument since the mausoleums of ancient emperors. Though the tomb would never be completed as planned, Michelangelo's frustration with the project would lead to one of art history's greatest achievements. The story of the Sistine Chapel ceiling began with Julius's dissatisfaction with its original star-painted vault. He commanded Michelangelo, who considered himself primarily a sculptor, to paint new frescoes on the ceiling. Michelangelo reluctantly accepted, then created a masterpiece that transformed the very concept of ceiling decoration. Working on scaffolding of his own design, lying on his back for hours at a time, he painted scenes from Genesis that combined biblical narrative with Renaissance humanism, depicting God and Adam as idealized human forms whose near-touching fingers became the most famous image of divine human connection ever created. The physical toll on Michelangelo was enormous. Paint dripped into his eyes, his neck and back ached constantly, and his eyesight deteriorated from constantly looking upward. He wrote a sardonic sonnet describing his contorted body, comparing himself to a Syrian bow bent backward. Yet he persevered for 4 years, creating over 300 figures that demonstrated mastery of anatomy, perspective, and theological symbolism that no artist had previously achieved. Julius also brought Raffaello Sanzio, known as Raphael, to the Vatican to decorate the papal apartments. The young artist from Urbino created frescoes in the stanza that balanced Michelangelo's dramatic power with serene harmony. His School of Athens placed the great philosophers of antiquity in a setting inspired by Bramante's designs for the new Basilica, suggesting that human reason and divine revelation could coexist in perfect balance. The fresco became a manifesto of Renaissance optimism about human potential. The competition between Michelangelo and Raphael, carefully cultivated by Julius, pushed both artists to exceed their previous achievements. Michelangelo suspected Raphael of sneaking into the Sistine Chapel to steal his techniques, while Raphael's charm and social grace contrasted with Michelangelo's notorious irascibility. Their rivalry energized the entire Roman art world, attracting artists from throughout Europe who came to study and compete for papal commissions. Julius died in 1513 before seeing his grand projects completed, but his successors continued the transformation. Leo X, son of Lorenzo de' Medici, brought Florentine sophistication to the papal court. A genuine intellectual who enjoyed theological debate and classical literature, Leo also loved luxury, spectacle, and entertainment. His coronation procession cost 100,000 ducats, 1/7 of the papal treasury, featuring pageants that recreated scenes from ancient Roman triumphs. Leo's pontificate coincided with the eruption of the Protestant Reformation, though he initially failed to grasp its significance. When an Augustinian monk named Martin Luther posted his 95 theses on the Wittenberg church door in 1517, challenging the sale of indulgences that funded St. Peter's construction, Leo dismissed it as a monkish squabble that would soon blow over. He could not have been more wrong about an event that would permanently fracture Western Christianity. Luther's challenge went beyond criticism of indulgences to question the entire basis of papal authority. He argued that Scripture alone, not papal tradition, should guide Christian faith, and that salvation came through faith alone, not through works or papal dispensations. His words, spread rapidly through printed pamphlets, found eager audiences among those disgusted by ecclesiastical corruption and princes eager to challenge papal power. Within a few years, entire regions of Germany had rejected Roman authority. The sack of Rome in 1527 by the troops of Emperor Charles V delivered a devastating blow to Renaissance papal pretensions. The imperial army, containing many Lutheran soldiers who saw the Pope as Antichrist, subjected the Eternal City to 8 days of pillage, rape, and murder that exceeded anything inflicted by earlier barbarian invasions. Pope Clement VII watched helplessly from the Castel Sant'Angelo as churches were desecrated, palaces burned, and priests murdered in the streets. The Vatican itself was ransacked, with soldiers stabbing their horses in the Sistine Chapel and using Raphael's frescoes for target practice. The trauma of the sack marked a turning point in papal history. The carefree confidence of the Renaissance gave way to a more somber recognition that the Protestant revolt represented an existential threat to Roman Catholicism. Paul III, elected in 1534, understood that reform could no longer be delayed. Though he had fathered illegitimate children as a young cardinal and practiced nepotism by appointing teenage grandsons to the Sacred College, he also recognized the need for genuine spiritual renewal. Paul III convened the Council of Trent in 1545, launching the Counter-Reformation that would transform Catholicism as profoundly as the Reformation had transformed Protestantism. The Council, meeting intermittently over 18 years, clarified Catholic doctrine in opposition to Protestant teachings, affirmed the authority of tradition alongside Scripture, and maintained the 7 sacraments that Protestants had reduced to 2. It also enacted practical reforms requiring bishops to reside in their dioceses, establishing seminaries to properly train priests, and standardizing the Mass into the form that would persist until the 20th century. The architectural implications of Trent were profound. Churches needed to be designed to emphasize the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, with clear sightlines to the altar, where the miracle of transubstantiation occurred. Protestant churches might be austere meeting houses for hearing sermons, but Catholic churches would be theatrical spaces designed to overwhelm the senses and inspire emotional devotion. The Vatican would lead this architectural revolution. Michelangelo, now in his 70s, was appointed chief architect of St. Peter's in 1547. He redesigned Bramante's plan, simplifying its complexity while strengthening its structure. Most importantly, he designed the Great Dome that would become the defining feature of the Roman skyline. Rising 448 feet from the floor to the top of the cross, the dome combined the Pantheon's scale with Gothic verticality, creating a structure that seemed to defy gravity while reaching toward heaven. The construction of the dome, completed after Michelangelo's death by Giacomo della Porta, required engineering solutions that pushed contemporary technology to its limits. Double shells reduced weight while maintaining strength, iron chains prevented outward thrust, and the lantern on top functioned as a keystone, locking the entire structure in place. Workers faced constant danger, with many falling to their deaths from the scaffolding that rose ever higher above the Roman streets. The new St. Peter's, finally consecrated in 1626, was the largest church in the world, capable of holding 60,000 worshippers. Its interior overwhelmed visitors with marble, gold, and artistic masterpieces that proclaimed the triumph of the Catholic faith. The bronze baldachin created by Gian Lorenzo Bernini over Peter's tomb stood 95 feet high, its twisted columns supposedly inspired by pillars from Solomon's temple. The visual message was clear that this was not merely a church, but the architectural embodiment of Christ's promise that the gates of hell would not prevail against his church. Bernini became the dominant artistic personality of the Baroque Vatican, serving 7 popes over 50 years. His colonnade embracing St. Peter's Square created one of the world's most dramatic architectural spaces, its arms reaching out like the church embracing humanity. The optical illusion he designed made the facade appear closer and more imposing than its actual distance, while the obelisk that Sixtus V had moved to the center provided a vertical accent that drew eyes heavenward. The Baroque transformation extended throughout the Vatican. Every surface became an opportunity for decoration that would inspire devotion and demonstrate papal power. Ceilings dissolved into heavenly visions populated by angels and saints. Walls disappeared behind marble revetments and gilded stucco, and light was manipulated through hidden windows to create mysterious illumination that seemed supernatural rather than natural. The cost of this magnificence was staggering. Paul V spent 162,000 scudi annually on St. Peter's construction, more than many nations' entire budgets. The money came from taxes on the papal states, donations from Catholic monarchs, and the continued sale of indulgences that had sparked the Reformation. Critics pointed out the irony of building a monument to a fisherman who had owned nothing with wealth extracted from the faithful, but the popes argued that such splendor gave glory to God and inspired faith. The new Vatican also required new ceremonies to match its grandeur. The papal coronation evolved into an elaborate ritual lasting hours, with the new pope carried on the sedia gestatoria through crowds of faithful while attendants burned flax before him, intoning Sic transit gloria mundi as a reminder that worldly glory passes. The papal mass became a carefully choreographed performance with multiple choirs, clouds of incense, and a cast of hundreds, creating a spectacle that reinforced papal majesty. The Vatican's art collections grew exponentially during this period as popes competed to acquire classical sculptures and contemporary paintings. The Vatican museums began to take shape, though they remained private papal collections rather than public institutions. Ancient statues excavated from Roman ruins were restored and displayed alongside Christian art, creating a visual argument for the continuity between classical civilization and Catholic culture. Urban VIII, the Barberini Pope who reigned from 1623 to 1644, epitomized both the achievements and excesses of the Baroque papacy. A patron of artists and scholars, he commissioned Bernini's baldachin and supported astronomical research. Yet he also practiced nepotism on a grand scale, enriching his family with church wealth, and his aggressive foreign policy impoverished the Papal States. His decision to strip bronze from the Pantheon's portico for St. Peter's prompted the famous pasquinade, "What the barbarians didn't do, the Barberini did." The completion of St. Peter's Basilica in 1626 marked the end of a 120-year construction project that had consumed the resources and energy of 20 popes. The new church stood as the greatest architectural achievement of the Catholic Reformation, a structure that proclaimed, through stone and space, the permanence and power of the papal office. Yet, even as Urban VIII consecrated the completed basilica, new challenges were emerging that would test whether magnificent architecture could substitute for the moral authority the papacy had lost. The scientific revolution posed questions that Baroque splendor could not answer. When Galileo's telescope revealed moons orbiting Jupiter and phases of Venus that supported the Copernican model of the solar system, the implications extended far beyond astronomy. If the Earth was not the center of the universe, what did that mean for humanity's place in creation? If ancient authorities like Aristotle could be wrong about the heavens, what else might they have gotten wrong? The trial of Galileo in 1633 took place in the Vatican Palace, in rooms decorated with frescoes celebrating the Church's triumph over heresy. The aged scientist, threatened with torture, recanted his support for the heliocentric model and spent his remaining years under house arrest. Yet his ideas could not be suppressed, and the Church's attempt to constrain scientific inquiry damaged its intellectual credibility among educated Europeans. The Vatican had won a battle but was losing the war for cultural authority. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648, ending the 30 Years' War, marked another crucial transition. The treaty established the principle that rulers could determine their subjects' religion, effectively ending papal claims to universal jurisdiction. The Pope's protests against the treaty were ignored, demonstrating his diminished influence in European politics. The Vatican remained magnificent, but its actual power increasingly extended only to purely spiritual matters and the direct government of the Papal States. As the 17th century drew to a close, the Vatican stood complete in essentially its modern form. The Great Basilica dominated the Roman skyline, the Papal Palace complex housed one of Europe's most sophisticated administrative bureaucracies, and the artistic treasures accumulated over centuries made it a cultural center of unparalleled richness. Yet this physical grandeur masked a spiritual and political authority in decline, challenged by Protestant competition, scientific discovery, and the rise of absolute monarchies that acknowledged no earthly superior. The Baroque Vatican represented both the triumph and the tragedy of the Counter-Reformation Papacy. It had created architectural and artistic masterpieces that still inspire awe, but at the cost of resources that might have been used for pastoral care and evangelical mission. It had asserted papal authority through visual splendor, but could not stop the fragmentation of Christianity or the secularization of European culture. The tomb of the fisherman now lay beneath the most magnificent church in Christendom, but the simple faith he had preached seemed almost lost amid the gold and marble erected in his name. The condemnation of Galileo in 1633 reverberated through European intellectual circles like a thunderclap, announcing that the Roman Church would resist the new learning even at the cost of appearing opposed to observable reality. The rooms where the trial took place, adorned with frescoes depicting the triumph of faith over heresy, became symbols of institutional rigidity rather than doctrinal purity. Cardinals who privately acknowledged the validity of Galileo's observations publicly maintained that scripture and tradition must take precedence over what mere human senses perceived through glass lenses. The decades following Galileo's trial witnessed an intellectual revolution that fundamentally challenged the medieval worldview the Vatican sought to preserve. Isaac Newton's Principia Mathematica described a universe operating according to mathematical laws that required no divine intervention beyond initial creation. John Locke argued for religious tolerance and government by consent of the governed, ideas that struck at the heart of papal claims to divinely ordained authority. The universe was becoming comprehensible through reason rather than revelation, and Europe's educated classes increasingly looked to natural philosophy rather than theology for explanations of reality. The Vatican's response to these challenges often seemed defensive and reactionary. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the list of forbidden books, expanded to include not just Protestant theology but scientific treatises, philosophical works, and even novels that might corrupt Catholic readers. The Roman Inquisition, renamed the Holy Office, maintained a network of censors and informants throughout Catholic Europe, though their effectiveness diminished as printing presses multiplied and literacy spread beyond clerical control. Yet within the Vatican itself, a more complex relationship with new learning developed than official pronouncements suggested. The Vatican Observatory, established in 1582 to reform the calendar, continued astronomical observations that quietly incorporated Copernican calculations, even while publicly maintaining geocentric language. The papal physicians employed the latest medical knowledge, including treatments condemned as materialistic when practiced by others. Cardinals collected mechanical curiosities and optical instruments, finding ways to appreciate scientific advancement without acknowledging its philosophical implications. The election of Innocent V in 1676 brought to the papal throne a man of genuine personal sanctity who attempted to reform the Baroque excesses of his predecessors. He reduced papal expenditures, curtailed nepotism, and lived with monastic simplicity in the vast papal palace. Yet his conflict with Louis XIV of France over royal claims to control the French Church revealed how completely absolute monarchs had replaced the Pope as arbiters of European politics. When Louis occupied the papal territory of Avignon and threatened to create a schismatic French church, Innocent could only respond with spiritual censures that the Sun King largely ignored. The War of Spanish Succession that erupted in 1701 demonstrated papal irrelevance in European power politics. Though the conflict involved the fate of Catholic Spain and threatened the balance of power throughout the continent, neither side sought papal mediation or even informed the Pope of treaty negotiations. Clement XII's attempts to maintain neutrality satisfied no one, and when he finally recognized the Bourbon claimant, the Austrian faction retaliated by invading the Papal States. The successor of medieval popes who had deposed emperors now watched helplessly as foreign armies marched across his territories. The intellectual movement known as the Enlightenment posed an even greater threat to papal authority than Protestant Reformation had done. While Protestants had argued about the proper interpretation of Christianity, Enlightenment philosophes questioned whether revealed religion had any validity at all. Voltaire's mockery of ecclesiastical pretensions found eager readers throughout Europe, while Denis Diderot's Encyclopédie presented human knowledge organized by reason rather than theology. The Vatican could ban these works, but it could not stop their ideas from spreading through salons, coffee houses, and academies. The suppression of the Jesuit order in 1773 revealed how completely the papacy had become subordinate to secular powers. The Society of Jesus had been the Church's most effective instrument of counter-reformation, establishing schools, missions, and networks of influence throughout the Catholic world. Yet when the Bourbon monarchs demanded their suppression, claiming the Jesuits threatened royal authority, Pope Clement XIV capitulated despite knowing the charges were largely fabricated. The papal brief Dominus ac Redemptor dissolved an order that had served the papacy faithfully for 2 centuries, demonstrating that popes could no longer protect even their most loyal servants against royal pressure. The American Revolution of 1776 established principles that challenged the entire basis of traditional authority, including papal claims to temporal power. The Declaration of Independence's assertion that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed contradicted the papal position that authority descended from God through established hierarchies. The United States Constitution's prohibition of religious establishment and guarantee of free exercise created a model of church-state relations that threatened the Vatican's vision of Catholic societies united under papal guidance. The French Revolution that began in 1789 brought these challenges directly to the Vatican's doorstep. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen proclaimed principles incompatible with traditional Catholic teaching about divine right and social hierarchy. The civil constitution of the clergy attempted to transform French Catholicism into a department of state, with bishops elected by citizens regardless of religion and required to swear loyalty to the constitution rather than the Pope. Pope Pius VI condemned these revolutionary changes, but his protests only intensified anti-clerical fury. Revolutionary armies invaded the Papal States in 1796, forcing the Pope to sign the humiliating Treaty of Tolentino that surrendered territory, treasure, and hundreds of precious manuscripts and artworks. The Vatican museums were stripped of their finest pieces, which were carted off to Paris as trophies of Enlightenment's triumph over superstition. The situation deteriorated further when French forces occupied Rome in 1798, proclaiming a Roman Republic on the ancient model. Pius VI, 81 years old and partially paralyzed, was arrested and dragged across the Alps in the middle of winter. He died in French captivity at Valence in August 1799, leading many to predict the papacy itself would not survive. The Times of London wrote his obituary not just as an individual but as the last pope, suggesting that the institution founded on Peter's Rock had finally crumbled. The conclave that elected Pius VII had to meet in Venice under Austrian protection, as Rome remained under French occupation. The new pope faced an impossible situation, with the Papal States dismembered, the Vatican occupied, and Catholic Europe convulsed by revolutionary warfare. Yet the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, who needed religious legitimacy for his regime, created unexpected opportunities for papal restoration. Napoleon's Concordat of 1801 with Pius VII re-established Catholicism in France, though on terms that made the Church clearly subordinate to state power. The Pope recognized the sale of confiscated church lands and accepted government nomination of bishops, painful concessions that nonetheless restored Catholic worship after years of revolutionary persecution. When Napoleon summoned Pius to Paris to crown him emperor in 1804, it seemed the papacy might recover some of its medieval glory. The coronation ceremony at Notre Dame Cathedral was carefully choreographed to demonstrate the new relationship between spiritual and temporal power. Pius VII blessed the crown, but Napoleon took it from the altar and placed it on his own head, showing that his authority came from his own achievements rather than papal sanction. The Pope was reduced to a decorative presence at his own ceremony, providing religious pageantry without real influence. Still, his mere presence gave Napoleon the legitimacy he craved, and massive crowds lined the streets to see the Pope, demonstrating persistent popular devotion despite revolutionary propaganda. The fragile alliance between Napoleon and Pius VII collapsed over the emperor's demands for papal support of his continental system against Britain. When Pius refused to close his ports to British ships or declare war on England, Napoleon annexed the Papal States entirely in 1809, declaring Rome the second city of the French Empire. The tricolour flew over the Castel Sant'Angelo, and French administrators governed from the Vatican Palace. The Pope's response was to excommunicate Napoleon, a spiritual weapon that had once toppled emperors but now seemed merely quaint. Napoleon's reaction showed how times had changed. Rather than seeking absolution, he had Pius arrested at the Quirinal Palace on the night of July 5, 1809. French soldiers broke down the doors with axes while the Pope sat quietly in his apartments, dressed in his white cassock and red cape, waiting for the inevitable. The journey into captivity became an unexpected triumph. As the papal carriage rolled through Italian towns, crowds gathered to seek blessing from the captive pontiff. Napoleon had to order that the Pope travel only at night to prevent these demonstrations of support. For nearly 5 years, Pius remained a prisoner, first at Savona on the Italian coast, then at Fontainebleau, near Paris. He steadfastly refused to yield on matters of principle, even when isolated from advisors and subjected to intense psychological pressure. The fall of Napoleon in 1814 allowed Pius VII to return to Rome in triumph. The Congress of Vienna restored most of the Papal States, and the Pope recovered many of the artworks looted by the French. The Vatican museums reopened with their treasures largely intact, and pilgrims again flocked to St. Peter's tomb. It seemed that revolutionary challenges to papal authority had failed, and traditional order had been restored. Yet the revolutionary genie could not be put back in its bottle. Secret societies like the Carbonari plotted to overthrow restored monarchies and create unified national states based on popular sovereignty. The Industrial Revolution was transforming European society in ways that made traditional Catholic social teaching seem increasingly irrelevant. Scientific discoveries continued to challenge biblical literalism, while historical criticism questioned the authenticity of documents on which papal claims rested. Pope Gregory XVI, who reigned from 1831 to 1846, responded to these challenges with intransigent conservatism. His encyclical Mirari Vos condemned freedom of conscience, freedom of the press, and separation of church and state as poisonous errors spawned by indifferentism. He opposed railroads in the Papal States, supposedly saying that chemins de fer, chemins d'enfer, or roads of iron, were roads to hell. Whether he actually said this or not, the Vatican became synonymous with opposition to progress and modernity. The election of Pius IX in 1846 initially seemed to herald a new era of papal liberalism. Young, charming, and apparently sympathetic to Italian nationalism, Pio IX was greeted with enormous enthusiasm. He granted amnesty to political prisoners, allowed limited press freedom, and established consultative assemblies in the Papal States. Liberals across Europe hailed him as the Pope who would reconcile the Church with modern civilization. The revolutions of 1848 shattered these illusions. When revolutionary fervor swept through Europe, toppling monarchies and proclaiming republics, Pius IX faced demands to lead a war of Italian liberation against Catholic Austria. His refusal triggered a radical revolution in Rome itself. On November 15, 1848, a mob surrounded the Quirinal Palace demanding democratic government and Italian unification. When the papal prime minister was shot on the stairs of the palace, Pius realized his position was untenable. 9 days later, disguised as an ordinary priest, Pius IX fled Rome in the carriage of the Bavarian ambassador. He took refuge at Gaeta in the Kingdom of Naples, while revolutionaries proclaimed a Roman Republic led by Giuseppe Mazzini and defended by Giuseppe Garibaldi. The Vatican was ransacked, with revolutionaries holding mock religious ceremonies and destroying symbols of papal authority. St. Peter's Basilica became a stable for revolutionary cavalry, its sacred spaces defiled by those who saw the Church as the enemy of human freedom. The Roman Republic lasted only 5 months before French troops sent by Louis Napoleon restored papal rule. Pius IX returned to Rome transformed from reformer to reactionary, convinced that liberalism and Catholicism were fundamentally incompatible. He withdrew to the Vatican, never again setting foot in the Quirinal Palace, and devoted himself to strengthening spiritual authority as temporal power slipped away. The Syllabus of Errors, published in 1864, represented Pius IX's comprehensive rejection of modern civilization. Its 80 condemned propositions included the ideas that reason could discover truth without revelation, that public schools should be free from church authority, that non-Catholic worship should be permitted in Catholic countries, and most famously, that the Roman pontiff can and should reconcile himself with progress, liberalism, and modern civilization. The document provoked outrage among liberals and embarrassment among Catholics trying to accommodate their faith with contemporary life. Yet even as Pius IX rejected political modernism, he embraced certain aspects of modernity that served papal purposes. The Vatican was among the first states to adopt telegraph technology, allowing rapid communication with bishops worldwide. Photography documented papal ceremonies and spread the Pope's image globally. Railways, eventually accepted despite earlier opposition, brought pilgrims to Rome in unprecedented numbers. The Vatican used modern means to propagate anti-modern messages. The definition of papal infallibility at the First Vatican Council in 1870 represented Pius IX's attempt to shore up spiritual authority as temporal power crumbled. The doctrine, declaring that the Pope could not err when speaking ex cathedra on matters of faith and morals, passed despite opposition from bishops who feared it would further alienate educated Catholics. The definition was narrowly drawn, but its symbolic importance was enormous, asserting supreme spiritual authority just as the Papal States faced final extinction. The timing proved tragically ironic. On July 18, 1870, as the Council proclaimed papal infallibility, France declared war on Prussia, beginning a conflict that would eliminate the last protection for papal temporal power. When French troops withdrew from Rome to defend their homeland, the newly unified Kingdom of Italy seized its opportunity. On September 20, 1870, Italian artillery breached the Aurelian walls near the Porta Pia, and the Bersaglieri poured into Rome. Pius IX ordered only token resistance to avoid bloodshed, then withdrew to the Vatican Palace, declaring himself a prisoner. The Kingdom of Italy offered him sovereignty over the Leonine city and an annual payment, but he refused any accommodation with what he considered a usurper government. For the next 59 years, popes would remain voluntary prisoners in the Vatican, never setting foot in Rome proper, maintaining the fiction that they remained rightful temporal sovereigns awaiting restoration. The loss of temporal power that seemed catastrophic to Pius IX would ultimately liberate the papacy from the burden of governing a second-rate Italian principality. Freed from the need to maintain armies, administer civil justice, and engage in the sordid compromises of temporal politics, future popes could focus on spiritual leadership and moral authority. The Vatican, reduced to 108 acres, would exercise greater global influence than the Papal States ever achieved with their thousands of square miles. Yet in 1870, as Pius IX looked out from his Vatican windows at Italian troops patrolling the streets of Rome, the future seemed dark indeed. The institution that had crowned Charlemagne, humbled Henry IV at Canossa, and launched the Crusades was now confined to a tiny enclave surrounded by a hostile state. The Vatican had become a prison, but it would prove to be a prison that paradoxically enhanced rather than diminished papal influence in the modern world. The death of Pius IX in 1878, after the longest pontificate in history, brought to the papal throne Gioacchino Pecci, who took the name Leo XIII and would transform the intellectual life of the Catholic Church. Unlike his predecessor, who had retreated into defensive isolation, Leo understood that the Church could not simply condemn the modern world, but must engage with it intellectually if it hoped to maintain relevance. From his voluntary imprisonment in the Vatican, he would launch an intellectual renaissance that demonstrated how papal authority could adapt to vastly changed circumstances. Leo inherited a church deeply divided between intransigents who rejected any accommodation with modernity and liberals who feared Catholicism was becoming an anachronism incompatible with scientific progress and democratic governance. The new pope, though personally conservative and maintaining his predecessor's claim to temporal sovereignty, recognized that the Church needed to articulate its positions in language that educated contemporaries could understand. He had spent 32 years as Bishop of Perugia, developing a reputation as an intellectual who could discuss Aquinas and Dante with equal facility. The restoration of Thomistic philosophy became Leo's first major initiative, culminating in the encyclical Aeterni Patris in 1879. By returning to Thomas Aquinas' synthesis of faith and reason, Leo sought to demonstrate that Catholic thought could engage with modern philosophy and science without surrendering fundamental truths. The establishment of the Pontifical Academy of St. Thomas Aquinas and the requirement that seminaries teach Thomistic philosophy created a generation of Catholic intellectuals equipped to debate on equal terms with secular scholars. The Vatican's secret archives, opened to researchers in 1881, represented another bold initiative that reversed centuries of defensive secrecy. Leo understood that historical scholarship would proceed with or without church cooperation, and that providing access to primary sources would enable Catholic historians to shape narratives about the Church's past. Scholars from around the world came to the Vatican to study documents dating back to the 8th century, discovering treasures like the registers of Innocent III and the trial records of the Knights Templar. The modernization of the Vatican Observatory under Leo demonstrated that the Church need not fear scientific investigation. Father Angelo Secchi, a Jesuit astronomer, had already pioneered stellar spectroscopy before Leo's pontificate, but the new pope expanded support for astronomical research and encouraged publication of findings in secular scientific journals. The observatory's work on stellar classification and variable stars earned international recognition, countering the perception that the Church remained hostile to science after the Galileo affair. Leo's most revolutionary act came with the publication of Rerum Novarum in 1891, an encyclical that addressed the social question posed by industrial capitalism. Rather than simply condemning socialism as his predecessors might have done, Leo acknowledged the legitimate grievances of workers subjected to exploitation and degrading conditions. He affirmed the right to private property while insisting it carried social obligations, supported workers' rights to form associations while rejecting class warfare, and called for state intervention to protect human dignity while maintaining the principle of subsidiarity. The encyclical's impact extended far beyond Catholic circles. Socialist leaders studied it carefully, finding unexpected common ground with papal teaching on workers' dignity. Industrialists who had dismissed the Church as irrelevant to modern economics suddenly faced moral challenges to unlimited capitalism. Catholic political parties and labor unions emerged across Europe, citing papal authority for programs that seemed dangerously progressive to traditional conservatives. The Vatican, physically confined to its tiny territory, was demonstrating global reach through moral teaching. The diplomatic initiatives of Leo's pontificate showed similar sophistication in adapting to changed circumstances. Unable to maintain traditional diplomatic relations as a temporal sovereign, Leo developed new forms of papal diplomacy focused on protecting Catholic interests through concordats and informal influence. His successful mediation between Germany and Spain over the Caroline Islands in 1885 demonstrated that papal arbitration could still carry weight in international disputes. The relationship with the United States particularly illustrated Leo's innovative approach. Despite American separation of church and state, which traditional papal teaching condemned, Leo recognized the vitality of American Catholicism and appointed the first apostolic delegate to Washington in 1893. His letter Longinqua Oceani praised American religious liberty while carefully noting it should not be considered the ideal arrangement. This nuanced position allowed American Catholics to be both patriotic citizens and loyal to Rome. Yet Leo's openness had limits, as demonstrated by his condemnation of Americanism in 1899. When certain American prelates seemed to suggest that the Church should adapt its doctrines to modern culture rather than simply its presentation, Leo drew a firm line. The letter, Testem Benevolentiae, distinguished between political and religious Americanism, accepting the former while condemning any suggestion that Catholic truth should evolve to match contemporary preferences. The conclave following Leo's death in 1903 witnessed the last exercise of the imperial veto, when Cardinal Mariano Rampolla, Leo's Secretary of State and expected successor, was excluded by Austrian objection. The cardinals elected Giuseppe Sarto, the Patriarch of Venice, who took the name Pius X and immediately abolished the right of secular powers to veto papal elections. This seemingly minor procedural change symbolically completed the Church's transition from a European institution intertwined with temporal politics to a global spiritual authority. Pius X's pontificate represented a dramatic reversal of Leo's intellectual openness. Where Leo had engaged with modern thought, Pius saw danger in any accommodation with contemporary ideas. His motto, to restore all things in Christ, signaled a program of internal purification that would become increasingly harsh as his reign progressed. The Pope, who would later be canonized as a saint, launched what many historians consider a reign of terror against Catholic intellectuals suspected of modernist tendencies. The anti-modernist campaign began with seemingly reasonable concerns about scholars who appeared to reduce Christianity to merely human dimensions. Alfred Loisey's historical criticism suggested the Church was not founded by Jesus, but evolved from his followers' experiences. George Tyrrell argued that dogmas were symbols pointing to divine reality rather than precise definitions of truth. These ideas genuinely threatened traditional Catholic understanding, but Pius's response went far beyond addressing specific errors. The decree Lamentabili Sine Exitu in 1907 condemned 65 propositions drawn mostly from Loisey's work, but framed so broadly that almost any historical critical scholarship became suspect. The encyclical Pascendi Dominici Gregis later that year went further, constructing a systematic presentation of modernism that no actual scholar held in its entirety, then condemning this synthetic heresy as the synthesis of all heresies. Every Catholic seminary professor, pastor, and confessor was required to take an oath against modernism that remained in force until 1967. The practical effects were devastating for Catholic intellectual life. Scholars who had devoted their lives to reconciling faith with modern learning found themselves silenced, removed from teaching positions, or even excommunicated. A network of informants called the Sodalitium Pianum operated as a kind of ecclesiastical secret police, reporting suspected modernists to Rome. Seminaries retreated into intellectual isolation, teaching a rigid neo-scholasticism that seemed increasingly disconnected from contemporary thought. The damage to Catholic scholarship would take generations to repair. Yet Pius X's reforms of liturgy and church practice had lasting positive effects. His encouragement of frequent communion reversed centuries of Jansenist-influenced practice that had made receiving the Eucharist a rare event for most Catholics. His lowering of the age for First Communion to 7 brought children into sacramental life earlier. His reforms of church music, promoting Gregorian chant and classical polyphony while restricting operatic styles, restored dignity to liturgical celebration. These changes demonstrated that internal reform could proceed without intellectual engagement with modernity. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 found the Vatican completely unprepared for a conflict that would pit Catholic nations against each other on an unprecedented scale. Pius X died just weeks after the war began, reportedly of a broken heart at seeing Christian Europe tear itself apart. His successor, Giacomo della Chiesa, who took the name Benedict XV, inherited a seemingly impossible situation where any papal position would alienate millions of Catholics fighting on opposite sides. Benedict chose the path of strict neutrality combined with humanitarian activism. His first encyclical, Ad Beatissimi Apostolorum, issued on November 1, 1914, called the war the suicide of civilized Europe and pleaded for peace without assigning blame to any party. This neutrality satisfied no one, with each side expecting papal support for their cause. French Catholics felt betrayed when the Pope refused to condemn German atrocities in Belgium, while German Catholics were outraged when he protested the deportation of Belgian workers. The Vatican's humanitarian efforts during the war demonstrated how papal moral authority could operate independently of political power. Benedict established a missing persons bureau that handled over 600,000 inquiries about prisoners of war and missing soldiers. Vatican diplomats negotiated exchanges of wounded prisoners and civilians, arranged for correspondence between prisoners and families, and distributed food and medicine in occupied territories. The Pope spent the Vatican's financial reserves so completely on relief efforts that his successor inherited a nearly empty treasury. Benedict's peace note of August 1917 proposed specific terms for ending the conflict, including evacuation of occupied territories, disarmament, arbitration of disputes, and freedom of the seas. The proposal was rejected by all belligerents, with French Premier Clemenceau dismissing it as favoring the Central Powers, while German leaders suspected it of being pro-Allied. The failure demonstrated the limitations of papal diplomacy in an era of total war driven by nationalism rather than dynastic disputes. The Russian Revolution posed a new kind of threat to the Vatican, as Bolshevism explicitly aimed to destroy all religion rather than simply subordinate it to state power. The murder of Orthodox clergy, desecration of churches, and proclamation of state atheism horrified Benedict, who saw in communism a more fundamental enemy than the Church had faced since Islam. His attempts to provide humanitarian aid to Russia during the famine of 1921-1922 were rejected by Soviet authorities who suspected Vatican agents of counter-revolutionary activities. The post-war period brought unexpected opportunities despite the Vatican's exclusion from the Versailles Peace Conference at Italian insistence. The collapse of the Austrian and German empires freed the Church from entanglements with dying dynasties. New states in Eastern Europe sought Vatican recognition to legitimize their independence. Missionary activity expanded in Africa and Asia as former German colonies came under new administration. The Church was becoming truly global rather than European, though this transformation would take decades to fully manifest. Benedict XV died in January 1922, having spent his entire pontificate dealing with war and its aftermath. His successor, Achille Ratti, who took the name Pius X, was an unlikely choice, a scholar and librarian who had spent most of his career among manuscripts rather than in pastoral work. Yet his experience as papal nuncio to Poland during the Polish-Soviet War had given him direct exposure to communism's threat, shaping his understanding that the Church faced ideological challenges requiring new responses. Pius V surprised everyone by appearing on the external balcony of St. Peter's to give his first blessing, breaking the tradition of papal self-imprisonment maintained since 1870. This gesture signaled willingness to engage with the Italian state that his predecessors had refused to recognize. Secret negotiations with Mussolini's government began almost immediately, as both sides recognized potential benefits from resolving the Roman question that had festered for 60 years. The Lateran Treaty, signed on February 11, 1929, created the State of Vatican City, the world's smallest sovereign nation at just 108 acres. The Pope renounced claims to the former papal states in exchange for recognition of Vatican independence, a financial settlement for lost territories, and establishment of Catholicism as Italy's state religion. The treaty resolved the anomaly of the Pope being subject to Italian law while claiming universal spiritual authority, creating a unique entity that was simultaneously a sovereign state and the headquarters of a global religion. The creation of Vatican City required rapid modernization of infrastructure within the tiny territory. A railway station was built to receive goods, though it would rarely carry passengers. A power plant, radio station, and telephone exchange were constructed to ensure Vatican independence from Italian utilities. The Vatican issued its own stamps and currency, established its own legal system based on canon law, and even created a small jail for the theoretical possibility of criminal cases within its borders. Vatican Radio, established in 1931 with Guglielmo Marconi himself supervising the installation, gave the Pope a means to communicate directly with Catholics worldwide without interference from hostile governments. Broadcasting in multiple languages, it could reach believers in countries where local churches were persecuted or silenced. This technological innovation proved particularly valuable as totalitarian regimes restricted traditional forms of religious communication. The relationship between the Vatican and Fascist Italy quickly soured despite the Lateran Treaty. Pius XII's encyclical Non Abbiamo Bisogno in 1931 condemned fascist attempts to monopolize youth education through mandatory membership in fascist organizations. The Pope had the encyclical smuggled out of Italy and published abroad to prevent Italian censorship, demonstrating that Vatican sovereignty provided real protection for papal independence even when surrounded by a totalitarian state. The rise of Nazism in Germany posed even graver challenges. Initially, some Vatican officials hoped to negotiate with Hitler, as they had with Mussolini, resulting in the Concordat of 1933 that theoretically protected Catholic rights in Germany. Pius V quickly realized his mistake as the Nazis systematically violated the agreement, arrested priests, closed Catholic schools, and promoted a racial ideology fundamentally incompatible with Christian universalism. The encyclical Mit brennender Sorge, issued in March 1937, was written in German rather than Latin and smuggled into Germany to be read from every Catholic pulpit on Palm Sunday before authorities could suppress it. The document condemned Nazi racial theories and the deification of state, race, and blood, though it carefully avoided naming Hitler directly. The Nazi response was ferocious, with hundreds of priests arrested and Catholic publications banned, but the encyclical had demonstrated papal willingness to confront totalitarianism despite obvious risks. Pius V showed similar courage in confronting communist persecution, issuing Divini Redemptoris just days after Mit brennender Sorge. This encyclical condemned communism as intrinsically evil and incompatible with Christianity, documenting persecution in the Soviet Union, Mexico, and Spain. The simultaneous condemnation of Nazism and communism positioned the Vatican as opposing all totalitarian ideologies that subordinated human dignity to state power. The Spanish Civil War presented agonizing dilemmas as Catholics fought on both sides of a brutal conflict. While most Spanish bishops supported Franco's nationalists against the anti-clerical republic, Pius V was troubled by nationalist atrocities and alliance with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. His refusal to declare the war a crusade despite pressure from Spanish bishops showed growing papal awareness that political alliances could compromise moral authority. The Vatican's response to Italian racial laws in 1938 revealed both courage and limitations in confronting evil. Pius V publicly declared that spiritually we are all Semites, and commissioned an encyclical condemning racism and anti-Semitism. His death in February 1939 prevented its publication, and his successor chose not to issue it, a decision that remains controversial. The draft, discovered decades later, showed how close the Vatican came to an explicit condemnation of racial persecution before the Holocaust began. Pius X's establishment of Catholic action organizations worldwide created a new model for lay Catholic engagement with modern society. Rather than forming explicitly Catholic political parties that had failed in many countries, Catholic action trained laypeople to bring Christian principles into secular organizations and professions. This strategy of indirect influence proved more effective than direct political involvement, allowing Catholics to shape society without triggering anti-clerical reactions. The financial reforms undertaken during Pius V's pontificate modernized Vatican economics for the 20th century. The appointment of Bernardino Nogara as financial advisor led to diversification of Vatican investments beyond Italian bonds into international markets. Though controversial, this professional management of Vatican resources created financial independence that would prove crucial during World War II and beyond. The Vatican could now fund global charitable and missionary activities without dependence on any single government. By Pius V's death in 1939, the Vatican had evolved from the prisoner state of 1870 into a unique institution combining spiritual authority with minimal but real temporal sovereignty. The 108 acres of Vatican City provided just enough independence to maintain papal freedom of action, while the absence of significant territory freed the papacy from governance burdens that had historically corrupted its spiritual mission. The stage was set for the Vatican to face its greatest moral test as Europe descended into another world war that would challenge fundamental assumptions about human nature and divine providence. The conclave of March 1939 took place under the shadow of impending war, with German troops having just occupied Czechoslovakia and Mussolini preparing to invade Albania. The cardinals elected Eugenio Pacelli on his 63rd birthday, taking only 3 ballots to choose the Vatican's most experienced diplomat to navigate the treacherous waters ahead. As Pius XIII, Pacelli would become perhaps the most controversial pope in modern history, praised by some as a prudent shepherd who saved countless lives through quiet diplomacy, condemned by others for his public silence during humanity's darkest hour. Pacelli brought unique preparation to the papal throne, having served as nuncio to Germany during the Weimar Republic, and negotiated the Concordat with Hitler's regime as Secretary of State. He spoke 12 languages fluently, understood the complexities of modern statecraft, and possessed an aristocratic bearing that commanded respect even from those who despised what he represented. Yet these very qualities that made him seem ideally suited for the crisis ahead would also limit his response to unprecedented evil. The invasion of Poland in September 1939 immediately tested Pius XII's diplomatic strategy of maintaining strict neutrality to preserve Vatican influence with all parties. His first encyclical, Summi Pontificatus, condemned the invasion without naming the aggressors, speaking instead of the blood of countless human beings, even non-combatants, crying out to heaven. This indirect language would characterize Vatican statements throughout the war, frustrating those who wanted explicit condemnation of Nazi crimes while allowing the Pope to claim he had spoken out against injustice. The Vatican's physical situation during the war was precarious, surrounded by fascist Italy and dependent on Italian infrastructure for food, water, and communications. When Italy entered the war in June 1940, the tiny state faced the possibility of occupation or bombardment. Pius V ordered Vatican radio to cease broadcasts critical of Nazi actions after German threats, choosing preservation of Vatican independence over prophetic denunciation. This decision would haunt his legacy, raising questions about whether institutional survival justified moral compromise. Behind the scenes, the Vatican operated extensive networks assisting refugees and prisoners of war. The Vatican Information Office processed millions of requests for information about missing persons, while Vatican diplomats negotiated with belligerent governments for prisoner exchanges and improved camp conditions. Convents and monasteries throughout Rome, including properties with extraterritorial status, sheltered thousands of refugees, with historians estimating that Catholic institutions hid up to 5,000 Jews in Rome alone during the German occupation. The systematic extermination of Jews presented the Vatican with its gravest moral challenge. Information about mass killings reached the Vatican through multiple channels, including detailed reports from Catholic military chaplains and underground church networks in occupied territories. Pius XV's response remains intensely debated, with defenders arguing his quiet diplomacy saved lives while critics contend his public silence enabled genocide. The Pope's Christmas message of 1942 referenced hundreds of thousands who, without any fault of their own, sometimes only by reason of their nationality or race, are marked down for death or progressive extinction. Words so oblique that few recognize them as referring to the Holocaust. The private actions of Vatican officials often showed more courage than public statements suggested. Monsignor Hugh O'Flaherty operated an underground network from within the Vatican that saved over 6,000 Allied prisoners and Jews, earning him the nickname Scarlet Pimpernel of the Vatican. Angelo Roncalli, the future John XIII, used his position as papal nuncio to Turkey to provide baptismal certificates to Hungarian Jews, enabling their escape. These individual acts of heroism occurred without explicit papal authorization, but also without Vatican interference, suggesting tacit approval of rescue efforts that official statements could not acknowledge. The bombing of Rome in July 1943 brought the war directly to the Vatican's doorstep. Though the Vatican itself was spared, the nearby San Lorenzo district was devastated. Pius V immediately visited the bombing site, his white cassock becoming blood-stained as he comforted victims and distributed money to survivors. This rare public appearance outside the Vatican showed a more pastoral side of a pope often criticized for remaining remote from human suffering. The image of the Pope among bombing ruins became one of the defining photographs of his pontificate. The German occupation of Rome from September 1943 to June 1944 placed the Vatican in extreme danger. SS troops surrounded Vatican City, and plans existed to kidnap the Pope and loot Vatican treasures. Pius V prepared a letter of resignation to prevent a puppet pope being installed if he were captured, while secretly organizing Vatican radio equipment to be hidden in the gardens for emergency broadcasts. The October 1943 roundup of Rome's Jews, occurring literally in the shadow of St. Peter's Dome, prompted Vatican protests through diplomatic channels, but no public papal condemnation that might have deterred the deportations. The liberation of Rome in June 1944 transformed Pius briefly into a hero, with Allied commanders praising his efforts to declare Rome an open city and prevent its destruction. Crowds filled St. Peter's Square to celebrate, and the Pope received Allied leaders in audiences that seemed to vindicate his diplomatic approach. Yet questions about his wartime conduct began almost immediately, with some Allied officials privately criticizing his failure to explicitly condemn Nazi atrocities even after Vatican City was secure from German retaliation. The post-war period required the Vatican to confront its relationship with defeated fascism and emerging communism. Pius XV's anti-communist stance was unequivocal, excommunicating Catholics who joined communist parties and supporting Christian democratic parties throughout Western Europe. The Vatican's involvement in smuggling Nazi war criminals to South America through rat lines, operated by Croatian priest Krunoslav Draganović, remains controversial, with debates about whether this reflected Vatican policy or unauthorized actions by anti-communist clerics who saw former Nazis as useful allies against Soviet expansion. The definition of the Assumption of Mary as dogma in 1950 demonstrated Pius XIV's use of spiritual authority to assert papal relevance in an increasingly secular world. The declaration that Mary was assumed body and soul into heaven was the first and only exercise of papal infallibility since its definition in 1870. The massive crowds attending the proclamation ceremony showed persistent popular Catholic devotion, despite the catastrophes of war and ongoing secularization of European society. Pius XIV's final years saw increasing isolation as his health declined, and he relied heavily on his German housekeeper, Sister Pascalina Lehnert, who controlled access to the Pope with an iron hand. His mystical experiences, including visions of Christ that he confided to close associates, suggested a man struggling with the burden of decisions made during humanity's darkest hour. His death in October 1958 at Castel Gandolfo ended a pontificate that had witnessed unprecedented evil and raised fundamental questions about the Church's role when confronting systematic murder. The conclave that elected Angelo Giuseppe Roncalli as John XXIII was expected to choose a transitional pope after Pius V's long and controversial reign. The 77-year-old Patriarch of Venice seemed perfect for a brief, uncontroversial pontificate that would allow the Church to catch its breath. Instead, this peasant son from Bergamo would launch the most radical transformation of Catholicism since the Council of Trent, opening windows that had been sealed for centuries. John XXIII's announcement on January 25, 1959, of his intention to convene an ecumenical council stunned the Vatican establishment. The Pope later claimed the idea came to him as a sudden inspiration from the Holy Spirit, though documents show he had been considering church reform since his election. The hostile reaction from the Curia, which saw no need for a council and feared loss of their power, only strengthened John's determination to proceed. He wanted to update the Church for the modern world through what he called aggiornamento, bringing the gospel message to contemporary humanity in language it could understand. The preparations for the Second Vatican Council revealed deep divisions within the Church about its relationship with modernity. The preparatory commissions, dominated by conservative curial officials, produced draft documents that essentially restated traditional positions in slightly updated language. John XXIII's opening address to the Council on October 11, 1962, dramatically shifted the agenda, criticizing prophets of doom within the Church and calling for a pastoral rather than condemnatory approach to the modern world. His distinction between the unchangeable deposit of faith and its historically conditioned expression opened space for genuine reform. The first session's debate on liturgy revealed the Council's revolutionary potential. Bishops from around the world challenged the monopoly of Latin in worship, arguing that people needed to understand what they were praying. The proposal to celebrate Mass facing the congregation rather than with the priest's back symbolized a fundamental shift from mysterious ritual to communal participation. Conservative prelates warned that abandoning Latin would fragment church unity, but missionary bishops responded that incomprehensible worship was already driving people away. John XXIII did not live to see the Council's completion, dying of stomach cancer on June 3, 1963, after the first session ended. His death prompted an extraordinary outpouring of grief from people of all faiths and none, testament to how profoundly this simple man had touched human hearts in less than 5 years. His Journal of a Soul, published posthumously, revealed a man of deep spirituality who saw his papal office as service rather than power, approaching each person with what he called the medicine of mercy rather than severity. The election of Giovanni Battista Montini as Paul VI represented continuity with John's vision, but with a more cautious temperament. A Vatican insider who had served as Pius XIV's closest collaborator before being exiled to Milan, Paul VI understood both the necessity of reform and the institutional resistance it would encounter. His decision to reconvene the council demonstrated commitment to change, but his interventions during debates showed anxiety about preserving unity and authority. The council's second session in 1963 tackled explosive issues of episcopal collegiality and religious freedom. The proposal that bishops shared governing authority with the Pope rather than merely serving as his delegates challenged centuries of papal monarchy. Paul VI's last-minute addition of a preliminary note of explanation to the Constitution on the Church, asserting that collegiality did not diminish papal primacy, satisfied neither progressives who wanted genuine power-sharing nor conservatives who opposed any dilution of papal authority. The Declaration on Religious Freedom, Dignitatis Humanae, represented the most dramatic reversal of traditional Catholic teaching. The Church that had condemned religious liberty as indifferentism now proclaimed it a fundamental human right based on human dignity. American bishops, led by John Courtney Murray, argued that the Church's own freedom depended on defending everyone's religious liberty. The violent opposition from traditionalists like Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, who saw this as betrayal of Christ's social kingship, foreshadowed schisms that would follow the Council. The pastoral constitution on the Church in the modern world, Gaudium et Spes, expressed a fundamentally different Catholic attitude toward contemporary civilization. Instead of condemning the modern world as inherently hostile to faith, the document acknowledged autonomy of earthly realities and engaged respectfully with contemporary culture. The Church presented itself as servant of humanity rather than ruler, sharing the joys and hopes, griefs and anxieties of contemporary people. This shift from triumphalism to dialogue transformed Catholic engagement with politics, science, and culture. The implementation of council reforms after its conclusion in December 1965 proved more traumatic than the council itself. The introduction of vernacular liturgy proceeded rapidly, with Latin virtually disappearing from parish worship within a few years. Altars were turned around, communion rails removed, and guitar masses replaced Gregorian chant. These changes, intended to increase participation, instead triggered fierce resistance from traditionalists who felt their sacred heritage was being destroyed. Many ordinary Catholics, unprepared for such rapid change, experienced profound disorientation. Paul VI's encyclical Humanae Vitae in 1968, reaffirming traditional prohibition of artificial contraception, shattered the post-conciliar optimism and revealed deep fissures within the Church. The Pope had removed birth control from conciliar discussion and appointed a special commission that ultimately recommended changing Church teaching. His decision to reject his own commission's advice and maintain the ban triggered unprecedented dissent from theologians, priests, and lay people who had expected the Church to adapt to modern understanding of sexuality and marriage. The reaction to Humanae Vitae went beyond disagreement with specific teaching to challenge papal authority itself. Entire episcopal conferences issued statements effectively nullifying the encyclical by emphasizing conscience over obedience. Thousands of priests left ministry rather than defend teaching they considered wrong, while millions of Catholics simply ignored papal prohibition and continued receiving sacraments. The credibility crisis created by Humanae Vitae permanently altered the relationship between the hierarchy and laity, with Catholics increasingly claiming the right to dissent from non-infallible teaching. The final decade of Paul VI's pontificate was marked by visible anguish as he witnessed the Church he loved torn apart by competing visions of renewal. Progressives accused him of betraying the Council by halting reforms, while traditionalists blamed him for destroying Catholic tradition. His 1969 reform of the Roman Missal, creating what became known as the Novus Ordo Mass, satisfied neither camp. Archbishop Lefebvre's schismatic movement attracted those who rejected all council reforms, while liberation theologians in Latin America pushed beyond conciliar texts toward revolutionary politics. Paul VI's death in August 1978 ended a pontificate that had transformed Catholicism more profoundly than any since the Reformation. The Church that had entered the 1960s as a monolithic institution emerged deeply pluralistic, with legitimate diversity of theological opinions, liturgical practices, and pastoral approaches. The Vatican's role had shifted from commanding obedience to coordinating communion among increasingly autonomous local churches. Whether this represented necessary adaptation or catastrophic dissolution remained fiercely debated. The election of Albino Luciani as John Paul III seemed to promise a new synthesis between tradition and renewal, and the Patriarch of Venice combined personal holiness with pastoral warmth, intellectual sophistication with simple faith. His choice of a double name honored both his conciliar predecessors, while his rejection of the coronation ceremony for a simple installation demonstrated commitment to evangelical simplicity. His infectious smile and informal speaking style immediately endeared him to millions who saw in him the human face of institutional church. The shocking death of John Paul I after only 33 days remains one of the Vatican's most enduring mysteries. The official explanation of a heart attack was undermined by confused and contradictory statements about who found the body and when. The Vatican's refusal to perform an autopsy fueled conspiracy theories about murder to prevent exposure of financial scandals or doctrinal changes. Whether he died naturally or was killed, his death symbolized the fragility of efforts to reform an institution with such deep roots and powerful interests. The Second Conclave of 1978 faced the task of choosing a pope for a church more divided than at any time since the Reformation. After 8 ballots, the cardinals made the revolutionary choice of a non-Italian, selecting Karol Wojtyła, the 58-year-old Archbishop of Krakow. The first Slavic pope, the first from a communist country, and the youngest elected in over a century, John Paul II would bring to the Vatican an energy and charisma that would transform the papacy into a global media phenomenon while reasserting traditional doctrine with unprecedented force. The new pope's inaugural homily on October 22, 1978, with its repeated cry of "Do not be afraid," announced a pontificate that would confront both communist oppression and Western secularism with equal vigor. His background in Polish resistance to both Nazi and Soviet totalitarianism shaped an understanding of human dignity and freedom that transcended conventional political categories. His philosophical training enabled sophisticated engagement with modern thought, while his mystical spirituality and Marian devotion appealed to traditional Catholics alienated by post-conciliar changes. John Paul II's first return to Poland as Pope in June 1979 demonstrated the transformative power of papal presence in the modern media age. The communist government could not prevent millions from attending outdoor masses where the Pope proclaimed human dignity and religious freedom without explicitly mentioning politics. The visit created a psychological revolution, showing Poles they were not alone and inspiring the solidarity movement that would eventually topple communist rule. The Vatican had discovered that a pope with charisma and courage could shape history more effectively than medieval pontiffs with armies. The transformation John Paul II witnessed in Poland during his 1979 visit was only the beginning of a pontificate that would fundamentally alter the balance of power in the Cold War. His support for solidarity went beyond symbolic gestures, with Vatican funds secretly channeled through church networks to support the Underground Union during martial law. The Pope's personal meetings with Lech Wałęsa and other opposition leaders gave them international legitimacy that the communist government could not counter, while his encrypted communications with Polish bishops coordinated resistance that remained just within the boundaries of religious activity. The attempted assassination on May 13, 1981 in St. Peter's Square nearly ended this historic pontificate before its full impact could unfold. Mehmet Ali Archer's bullets struck the Pope as he blessed pilgrims from his open vehicle, one passing millimeters from his aorta in what John Paul II would later describe as Our Lady of Fatima's hand guiding the bullet's path. The image of the wounded Pope, white cassock stained with blood, while maintaining consciousness long enough to bless his would-be assassin, became one of the defining moments of his papacy. The recovery period revealed the Pope's extraordinary physical resilience and spiritual depth. From his hospital bed at Gemelli Clinic, which Romans began calling Vatican III due to his frequent stays, John Paul II forgave Archer publicly and later visited him in prison for a private conversation that remains secret to this day. The assassination attempt paradoxically strengthened rather than weakened his influence, creating an aura of divine protection around a pope who seemed destined to complete a special mission. The question of who ordered the assassination has never been definitively answered, though evidence points toward Bulgarian intelligence services acting on Soviet orders. The KGB recognized John Paul II as an existential threat to communist control of Eastern Europe, correctly assessing that his moral authority exceeded their military power. Recently declassified documents from Warsaw Pact archives reveal the depth of communist anxiety about the Polish Pope and various schemes considered to neutralize his influence, from character assassination to actual murder. John Paul II's theological vision, articulated through an unprecedented number of encyclicals and apostolic letters, reasserted traditional Catholic teaching while engaging with contemporary concerns in innovative ways. His theology of the body, delivered through 129 Wednesday audiences, presented human sexuality as revealing divine love rather than simply establishing moral rules. This positive vision of embodied existence challenged both secular hedonism and religious prudishness, though its dense philosophical language limited popular impact during his lifetime. The Pope's travels, totaling over 1 million miles to 129 countries, transformed the papacy from a Roman institution into a truly global presence. These journeys were not mere ceremonial visits, but carefully orchestrated events designed to strengthen local churches, challenge oppressive governments, and demonstrate Catholic universality. His ability to speak to millions in their own languages, celebrate Mass in local rites, and kiss the ground upon arrival created emotional connections that transcended doctrinal disagreements. The World Youth Days, initiated by John Paul II in 1985, created a new form of Catholic gathering that combined pilgrimage, festival, and evangelization. These events, drawing millions of young people to celebrate faith with rock concert enthusiasm, countered the narrative of Christianity as a dying religion of the elderly. The Pope's ability to connect with youth, despite the generation gap, and his increasingly conservative positions on sexual morality, demonstrated a charismatic authority that transcended logical explanation. Yet this same pontificate was marked by financial scandals that revealed persistent corruption within Vatican institutions. The collapse of Banco Ambrosiano in 1982, with the Vatican Bank as its main shareholder, exposed a web of money laundering, fraud, and possible connections to organized crime. The mysterious death of Roberto Calvi, found hanging under Blackfriars Bridge in London, added sensational elements of possible murder and Masonic conspiracy to what was already a devastating blow to Vatican credibility. Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, the American prelate running the Vatican Bank, became a symbol of ecclesiastical involvement in financial criminality. His claim of sovereign immunity to avoid Italian prosecution, while legally valid, reinforced perceptions of the Vatican as a law unto itself. John Paul II's response, appointing a commission of cardinals to investigate while refusing to surrender Marcinkus to Italian authorities, showed the limits of his reformist agenda when institutional interests were threatened. The attempts to reform Vatican finances proceeded slowly and incompletely throughout John Paul II's pontificate. The establishment of the Prefecture for Economic Affairs and the appointment of lay financial experts demonstrated recognition that clerics lacked competence in modern banking. Yet the fundamental opacity of Vatican finances remained, with multiple agencies operating without consolidated accounting or external auditing. The Vatican Bank continued to function as a haven for questionable transactions, protected by banking secrecy that exceeded even Swiss standards. The fall of the Berlin Wall on November 9, 1989, vindicated John Paul II's strategy of moral resistance to totalitarianism. His role in communism's collapse, while difficult to quantify precisely, was acknowledged even by Soviet leaders. Mikhail Gorbachev later stated that the collapse of communism would have been impossible without John Paul II, while Stalin's question about how many divisions the Pope commanded had been definitively answered through the power of moral authority, mobilizing millions. The Pope's response to communism's collapse showed both triumph and caution. His visits to newly liberated Eastern European countries drew massive crowds celebrating religious freedom after decades of suppression. Yet he also warned against replacing communist materialism with capitalist consumerism, arguing that authentic freedom required moral discipline rather than mere political liberty. His encyclical Centesimus Annus in 1991 critiqued both socialist collectivism and unrestrained capitalism, proposing a third way based on human dignity and social solidarity. The clerical sexual abuse crisis that exploded into public consciousness during John Paul II's final years cast a dark shadow over his legacy. The case of Father Martial Maciel, founder of the Legion of Christ, exemplified the Pope's failure to address predatory behavior by charismatic religious leaders. Despite credible accusations dating back decades, John Paul II praised Maciel as a model priest and refused to investigate allegations that he had sexually abused seminarians and fathered multiple children. The American abuse scandal that erupted in 2002 with revelations about systemic cover-ups in Boston Archdiocese demonstrated that the problem extended far beyond individual bad actors. John Paul II's response, initially dismissing the crisis as American media exaggeration and moral panic, evolved slowly toward acknowledging what he called a profound contradiction in priests who were supposed to lead children to God, instead becoming their abusers. Yet his emphasis on prayer and personal holiness rather than structural reform failed to address systemic factors enabling abuse. The Pope's declining health in his final years became itself a form of witness as he refused to resign despite Parkinson's disease that progressively limited his mobility and speech. His public suffering, broadcast globally through television coverage of increasingly difficult papal appearances, presented a countercultural message about the dignity of human life, even in weakness. The image of the once athletic Pope slumped in his wheelchair, drooling and barely able to speak, yet continuing to exercise his office, challenged societies increasingly comfortable with euthanasia. John Paul II's death on April 2, 2005, triggered an unprecedented global response, with millions traveling to Rome for his funeral while billions watched on television. The cry of "Santo subito" from the crowd demanded immediate canonization, reflecting popular recognition of his historical importance and personal holiness. Yet the rush to sainthood, accomplished by his successor in record time, prevented full reckoning with the failures of his pontificate, particularly regarding clerical abuse and financial corruption. The conclave that elected Joseph Ratzinger as Benedict XVI chose deliberate continuity with John Paul II's theological vision while recognizing need for different leadership style. The German cardinal had served as John Paul II's doctrinal enforcer for 24 years, earning the nickname God's Rottweiler for his aggressive defense of orthodoxy. Yet those who knew him personally described a shy, scholarly man more comfortable with books than crowds, whose selection as Pope at age 78 suggested a transitional pontificate. Benedict's intellectual approach to the papacy contrasted sharply with his predecessor's charismatic style. His Jesus of Nazareth trilogy demonstrated a pope capable of serious biblical scholarship, engaging contemporary exegesis while maintaining traditional Christological doctrine. His lectures on the Church Fathers and medieval theologians revealed encyclopedic knowledge and genuine love for the Catholic intellectual tradition. Yet this same erudition sometimes created problems, as when his Regensburg lecture in 2006 quoted a Byzantine emperor's criticism of Islam, triggering violent protests despite his clarification that he was not endorsing the quoted view. The establishment of the Anglican Ordinariate in 2009, allowing Anglican congregations to enter Catholic communion while maintaining their liturgical traditions, showed Benedict's ecumenical creativity and respect for legitimate diversity within unity. His permission for wider use of the traditional Latin Mass through Summorum Pontificum satisfied traditionalists marginalized since Vatican II, while angering progressives who saw it as retreating from conciliar reforms. These initiatives reflected Benedict's vision of a smaller, purer church that maintained its identity rather than accommodating secular culture. The Vatican's response to the global clerical abuse crisis accelerated under Benedict, though never fast enough for victims and their advocates. His meetings with abuse survivors, unprecedented for a pope, acknowledged church responsibility more directly than John Paul II ever had. His revision of canon law to streamline laicization of abusive priests and his discipline of Martial Maciel showed willingness to act against powerful figures his predecessor had protected. Yet the crisis continued to metastasize, with revelations of abuse and cover-ups emerging from Ireland, Germany, Australia, and virtually every country with significant Catholic populations. The Vatileaks scandal that erupted in 2012 exposed internal dysfunction that Benedict seemed unable to control. Paolo Gabriele, the Pope's butler, leaked confidential documents revealing corruption, careerism, and vicious infighting within the Vatican bureaucracy. The documents showed a pope isolated by courtiers who filtered information and pursued personal agendas while invoking his authority. Benedict's response, pardoning Gabriele while leaving systemic problems unaddressed, demonstrated either Christian mercy or administrative weakness, depending on perspective. Benedict XVI's announcement on February 11, 2013, that he would resign the papacy effective February 28, shocked the Catholic world more than any event since John Paul III's death. Speaking in Latin to a routine consistory, the Pope declared that his strength was no longer adequate for the Petrine ministry in the modern world. This first papal resignation since Gregory the Fiend in 1415 shattered the mythology of the papacy as a supernatural office that transformed its holder, revealing instead an elderly man acknowledging human limitations. The resignation's timing raised questions that remain unanswered. Some speculated that Benedict had received information about scandals that would destroy his pontificate if revealed. Others suggested pressure from financial interests threatened by his reforms. The official explanation of declining health seemed insufficient given that popes had previously governed while practically comatose. Benedict's creation of the unprecedented role of Pope Emeritus, maintaining papal title and dress while lacking authority, created canonical ambiguities that continue to trouble church lawyers. The conclave of March 2013 faced the unique situation of electing a pope while his predecessor lived in retirement within Vatican walls. The cardinals recognized need for dramatic change, rejecting European candidates associated with institutional dysfunction. The election of Jorge Mario Bergoglio, taking the name Francis, represented multiple historical firsts as the first Jesuit pope, first from the Americas, and first from the Southern Hemisphere. His choice of name, honoring the medieval saint of poverty and simplicity, signaled programmatic intentions that would challenge Vatican culture. Francis's initial gestures communicated profound shifts in papal style and possibly substance. His decision to live in the Vatican guest house rather than the apostolic palace, his rejection of elaborate vestments for simple white, his washing of prisoners' feet, including women and Muslims, all demonstrated a populist approach that delighted progressives and alarmed traditionalists. His spontaneous phone calls to ordinary Catholics, his informal homilies at morning mass, his evident comfort with children and disabled persons created an image of accessibility unprecedented in modern papacy. The new pope's background as Archbishop of Buenos Aires during Argentina's economic crisis shaped his understanding of poverty and structural injustice. His experience navigating between military dictatorship and liberation theology gave him sophisticated appreciation for political complexity. His pastoral work in Buenos Aires slums, traveling by public transportation, and knowing parishioners by name provided credibility when speaking about accompaniment and encounter. This was not an academic theologian theorizing about poverty, but a pastor, who had touched it directly. Francis's apostolic exhortation Evangelii Gaudium, issued within his first year, articulated a vision of church reform more radical than anything since Vatican II. His critique of economy of exclusion and inequality challenged comfortable accommodation with capitalism, while his call for a poor church for the poor questioned institutional wealth and privilege. His famous declaration that he preferred a church which is bruised, hurting, and dirty because it has been out on the streets, rather than one concerned with being at the center, directly challenged Vatican-centric Catholicism. The synods on the family convened in 2014 and 2015 revealed Francis's different approach to church governance, encouraging open debate rather than predetermined conclusions. The public disagreements between cardinals over communion for divorced and remarried Catholics would have been unthinkable under previous popes. Francis's post-synodal exhortation Amoris Laetitia, with its emphasis on conscience and pastoral accompaniment rather than rigid rules, triggered fierce resistance from traditionalists who accused him of undermining doctrine through ambiguity. The reforms of Vatican finances under Francis showed both progress and resistance to change. The appointment of Cardinal George Pell as prefect of the new Secretariat for the Economy promised serious reform, but his efforts were systematically undermined by entrenched interests. The auditing firm PricewaterhouseCoopers was dismissed after discovering undisclosed accounts worth hundreds of millions of euros. Pell himself was recalled to Australia to face abuse charges, later overturned, that some suspected were orchestrated to remove a reformist threat. The clerical abuse crisis continued to plague Francis's pontificate despite his establishment of the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors and promises of zero tolerance. His initial skepticism about abuse claims in Chile, followed by dramatic reversal after investigation, confirmed widespread cover-up, damaged his credibility on the issue. The Pennsylvania Grand Jury report in 2018 and revelations about former Cardinal Theodore McCarrick's decades of abuse showed that the crisis was far from resolved and possibly worse than previously understood. Francis's relationship with the Roman Curia has been marked by mutual incomprehension and occasionally open conflict. His creation of a council of cardinals from around the world to advise on governance reform bypassed traditional Vatican power structures. His amalgamation of previously independent congregations and his appointment of outsiders to key positions disrupted established networks. His public criticisms of careerism, clericalism, and spiritual Alzheimer's among Vatican officials created a climate of uncertainty and resentment. The Pope's engagement with global issues from climate change to migration has expanded papal involvement in secular politics beyond traditional boundaries. His encyclical Laudato Si on environmental protection established the Vatican as a significant voice in climate debates. His advocacy for refugees and migrants, symbolized by his visit to Lampedusa and bringing Syrian families back to Rome, challenged rising nationalism and xenophobia. His mediation between the United States and Cuba demonstrated continued papal capacity for diplomatic breakthrough. The opposition to Francis from traditionalist Catholics has been more organized and vocal than resistance to any pope since Paul VI. Websites like LifeSite News and 1 Peter 5 provide platforms for daily criticism of papal statements and actions. The dubia submitted by 4 cardinals challenging Amoris Laetitia represented unprecedented public questioning of papal teaching. Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano's call for Francis to resign over the McCarrick scandal showed how completely some Catholics had rejected papal authority they considered compromised. The COVID-19 pandemic that began in 2020 found Francis leading a church unable to gather for communal worship, the essential act defining Catholic identity. His solitary prayer in an empty St. Peter's Square on March 27, 2020, broadcast globally, became an iconic image of spiritual leadership during crisis. The pandemic accelerated existing trends toward declining mass attendance and vocations, while revealing the fragility of institutional structures dependent on physical gathering and financial contributions. As Francis enters his late 80s, speculation about resignation intensifies, particularly given Benedict's precedent and Francis's own statements that he would resign if health prevented effective ministry. The prospect of a conclave with potentially 2 living popes emeritus creates unprecedented complications for an institution that has always emphasized unity under a single successor of Peter. The next pope will inherit a church more divided than at any time since the Reformation, facing challenges from secularization, scandal, and internal dissent that threaten its coherence and credibility. The Vatican City-state that exists today functions as one of the world's most peculiar political entities, a theocratic absolute monarchy where the Pope exercises executive, legislative, and judicial power unchecked by any earthly authority. Yet this concentration of power operates through a bureaucratic apparatus that has evolved over centuries into a labyrinthine structure where real authority often lies not in formal positions, but in proximity to the papal apartment and mastery of unwritten protocols. The government of Vatican City-state, distinct from but overlapping with the Holy See's religious governance, manages the practical affairs of 825 residents and roughly 4,000 employees who commute daily from Italy. The Pontifical Commission for Vatican City-state, established by the Lateran Treaty, theoretically governs the temporal aspects of the world's smallest nation, but its president answers directly to the Pope, who can overturn any decision with a handwritten note. The Vatican's legal system, based on canon law supplemented by Italian civil law when applicable, operates through a tribunal that rarely convenes, since serious crimes are nearly non-existent within the walls. The single jail cell beneath the Vatican courthouse has housed only a handful of prisoners in its history, most recently Paolo Gabriele during the Vatileaks scandal, though he spent his evenings under house arrest in his Vatican apartment. The economic structure of Vatican City depends on a unique combination of investment returns, donations, museum revenues, and sales of stamps and souvenirs that generate roughly €300 million annually. The Vatican pharmacy, accessible only to those with Vatican identification or special permission, has become legendary for stocking medications unavailable in Italy, creating a peculiar medical tourism among Rome's elite. The Vatican supermarket, similarly restricted, offers international products and tax-free prices that make employment in the Vatican financially attractive beyond mere salaries. The administration of the patrimony of the Apostolic See manages the compensation Italy paid for the loss of the Papal States, invested in a portfolio that has grown despite periodic scandals and mismanagement. The Vatican Bank, officially the Institute for the Works of Religion, continues to operate under stricter oversight following decades of money laundering scandals, though its culture of secrecy persists despite promises of transparency. The Prefecture for Economic Affairs, created to provide oversight, struggles against institutional resistance from departments accustomed to financial independence and minimal accountability. Vatican diplomacy operates through a network of 183 diplomatic relations, making the Holy See one of the most connected entities in international affairs, despite controlling no significant territory or resources. Papal nuncios serve simultaneously as ambassadors and ecclesiastical representatives, monitoring local churches while engaging in traditional diplomacy. This dual role creates unique advantages, as nuncios can access both government officials and grassroots religious networks, gathering intelligence and exercising influence through channels unavailable to conventional diplomats. The Vatican's soft power manifests most clearly in its ability to convene and mediate, bringing together parties who refuse to meet under other auspices. The community of Sant'Egidio, while technically independent, operates with Vatican blessing as an unofficial diplomatic service, negotiating peace agreements in Africa and Asia where official Vatican involvement would be politically impossible. The Pope's annual World Day of Peace message sets themes that influence international discourse, while papal audiences with world leaders generate media coverage that smaller nations could never achieve. The Secretariat of State, functioning as both Foreign Ministry and Prime Minister's office, coordinates this diplomatic activity through a structure unchanged since the Renaissance. The Secretary of State, always a cardinal, serves as the Pope's principal assistant in governing the Universal Church while managing Vatican foreign relations. The substitutes for general affairs and for relations with states divide responsibilities in ways that create beneficial redundancy, but also institutional rivalry and occasional paralysis when consensus cannot be achieved. Vatican intelligence gathering operates through informal networks rather than a formal intelligence service, relying on nuncios, missionary orders, and Catholic institutions worldwide to provide information. The Jesuits, despite periodic tensions with the hierarchy, maintain particularly valuable networks in education and social justice movements. Catholic universities, hospitals, and charitable organizations provide additional observation posts in societies where the Church lacks official representation. This distributed intelligence system, while lacking the technical sophistication of state intelligence agencies, provides nuanced cultural and social understanding often missing from conventional diplomatic reporting. The Vatican museums contain one of humanity's greatest art collections, accumulated over centuries through papal patronage, donations, and occasionally questionable acquisitions. The 54 galleries display only a fraction of holdings that include 70,000 works from ancient Roman sculptures to contemporary religious art. The Sistine Chapel alone generates sufficient revenue through visitor fees to fund significant portions of Vatican operations, though the crowds necessary for financial sustainability threaten the very artworks they come to admire. The restoration workshops hidden within the Vatican museums employ some of the world's finest conservators, using advanced technology to preserve artifacts ranging from ancient papyri to Renaissance frescoes. The recent cleaning of Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel frescoes revealed colors so vibrant that some art historians initially claimed the restoration had damaged the originals. The ongoing digitization projects aim to make Vatican collections accessible globally while creating backup records should originals be damaged by age, climate change, or human conflict. The Vatican's secret archives, renamed the Vatican Apostolic Archives in 2019, to avoid conspiracy theories, contain 85 kilometers of shelving holding documents spanning 12 centuries. The archives include correspondence of popes, trial records of the Knights Templar, letters from historical figures like Mary Queen of Scots and Abraham Lincoln, and administrative records that chronicle the evolution of Western civilization. Scholars who gain access after lengthy application processes often discover documents that reshape historical understanding, though vast portions remain uncatalogued and effectively inaccessible.